So far on my journey to look at superhero film and TV projects relating to those films, I looked at the first two phases of the MCU and the entirety of the DCEU. Now, it may not be the most exciting next step, but before looking into the other films based on the DC universe, since nothing else really falls into a universe per se, I decided the next course of action would be to go way back to the start and watch some DC serials. I watched many of these when I was a kid, watching the Batman and Superman entries back when Netflix would send discs and had a surprisingly diverse DVD library, and remember finding them much more dull than the modern DC films, naturally. But there is almost something fascinating about them in hindsight. The absurd racism and dated nature of Batman's first cinematic entry, or the way these films tried to adapt the comic book medium on shoestring budgets 60 odd years before that would become a major piece of Hollywood's larger system. The superhero genre, or at least the modern superhero genre, was started back in 1938 with the creation of Superman, a character that was more or less a modern interpretation of gods like Thor or Hercules, kind of, but not really. That would explode and see dozens of other publishers throw their hat in the ring, with millions upon millions of copies being sold in the late 30s and 40s of the most popular comics, especially when America was involved in World War II. Before the genre would go stagnant following the war, with comics usually being comedy, horror, romance, or whatnot at that time, superheroes would of course rise again with the Fantastic Four over at Marvel, and Barry Allen's reimagined Flash would start around the same time, with the Fantastic Four and Barry Allen's reimagined Flash starting the Silver Age of comics. So flashback to the 1940s, and with these characters being big business, Hollywood wanted a piece of the action and started making serials about superheroes. Now you may be asking what a serial is, and it's kind of sort of like a movie and kind of sort of like a TV show. You see, televisions took a really long time to make and really didn't start becoming a consumer product till the 1940s, with shows becoming common starting in the 1950s. Before that, we had radio, which very much had some superhero presence. See the long-running Superman radio program, which launched the character further into popularity. Serials were basically the proto-TV show. Starting in the 1910s, they would be short reels played in theaters that would go on week by week, each part showing an episode of this serial that would tell a larger story across however many parts. This, of course, lost popularity as TV started allowing these to be sent into the home via broadcast, and the format was just dated as Hollywood became a grander entity. Movie houses and drive-ins were primarily showing films with a B-movie before or after. These were often cheap films, keeping people around to buy more stuff, and as a result of TV and the rise of the B-movie, these just no longer really had a purpose. Regardless, much of early cinema's adaptations of superheroes were more proto-superheroes like the Shadow, Green Hornet, Lone Ranger, Deadwood Dick, and more. So naturally, as modern superheroes came out following the release of Superman, modern superheroes would be brought into the fold a bit. This video is going to explore the DC serials, though notably, Spy Smasher and Captain Marvel were actually owned by Fawcett in this era, and the Blackhawks were owned by Quality Comics. Eventually I'll talk about the Captain America serial, which was the only Marvel-based serial that ever came out. That's a whole nother can of worms I'll eventually cover. Anyhow, today we'll be looking at serials based on properties that are now owned by DC Comics. So let's get into it. Adventures of Captain Marvel, in a way, is the first major comic book film being released in 1941 across 12 chapters, and adapting the very popular comic book superhero of the day, Captain Marvel, or Shazam, since this guy and this guy came and took his name. The full production was shot in December 1940 to January 1941, taking about 3 weeks to shoot. Republic Pictures, the company that made the film, really wanted to make a serial about Superman, but couldn't get the rights to the character, so they opted to hit up the rival company Fawcett, the company that created Captain Marvel, to see if they could use their character, since DC wouldn't buy Fawcett's catalog until way down the line. Hell, in this era, Fawcett and DC were distantly the most popular comic book companies, given the success of Superman and Captain Marvel. Anyhow, the script for the Superman project that they were developing was completed, but since it was vetoed, that film would be retooled into The Mysterious Dr. Satan, which would be a Superman knockoff film following the exploits of Bob Wayne, the Copperhead, and his girlfriend Lois Scott. I swear, plagiarism laws back in the day were damn loose. Imagine pitching a script and having it rejected, then just making it anyways, by simply changing the love interest's last name and then taking a different asset from the company and slightly retooling it as the main character's new name. I mean, Bob Wayne, Bruce Wayne, not exactly subtle. DC Comics, then National Publications, actually tried to get The Adventures of Captain Marvel to not be produced, suing over the vague idea that Republic was denied a Superman film, thus they shouldn't be able to use the competition, though that never went anywhere, and a more blanket Captain Marvel vs. Superman lawsuit wouldn't come till a bit down the line. Frank Cooligan was cast as Billy Batson and Tom Tyler as Captain Marvel, though Tom Tyler was a bit lanky for the role and apparently was pretty bad at setups, accidentally beating on actors for real during fight scenes or knocking over and ruining the flimsy props on set. The Lydecker brothers, who did much of Republic's effects and serials back in the day, had to find a way to make Captain Marvel fly, and did so by flinging around a 7-foot dummy on strings. David Sharp, a Golden Age stunt performer, would start the effect by just launching himself directly into the air, and then try to pull out so not to snap his back like a twig. Safety standards were not much of a thing back in the day. The costumes for Captain Marvel looked well enough, though the logo is, not great. But apparently people really fucked with this costume, since the Adventures of Superman TV show somehow acquired one of the suits, and a Kryptonian council member in the first episode of the show can be seen wearing it, as well as in the sci-fi show Space Patrol, which also used the costume. The plot is fairly standard for a serial and is a whodunit mystery. Basically, Billy Batson is on an archaeological voyage to a volcanic area guarded by natives with a group of people when they find a scorpion relic with a series of lenses that can be put on it to make the so-called Golden Scorpion, a deadly super weapon that can also make gold out of random metals. Billy ends up bored by the whole thing and ends up wandering off, but the wizard Shazam pulls up and gives him the powers of Captain Marvel. Shazam! Upon their return to America, a man called Scorpion is trying to steal the Golden Scorpion and its lenses, plotting to take the pieces from each of the men on the voyage, since each man was tasked with safeguarding one of the lenses. Like goddamn Thanos with the Infinity Stones. Though with that, the Scorpion himself was revealed to be one of the group's men. Of course, Captain Marvel does some Shazamming to foil his plots one by one to get these lenses, but eventually they head back to the volcanic area and they find out the offending scientist was Luther Bentley. But the natives kill him.
I'm going to show you how you've been misled by an imposter. Bentley.
Anyways, Captain Marvel then tosses the contraption into the volcano like the Ring of Power in The Lord of the Rings, and the surviving scientists head home, and I guess they live happily ever after or whatever. We never see them again. This movie was not uncommon with serials comprising an almost entirely new cast with very few adaptations beyond the main character. Billy Batson, or Captain Marvel, who these days goes by Shazam since the name was taken by a few other heroes after his name was no longer copyrighted following the collapse of Fawcett Comics, first appeared in Whiz Comics #2 from 1940 and was a pretty direct response to Superman. Basically, the idea, as created by Bill Parker and C.C. Beck, was what if Superman was a kid instead of Clark Kent, or rather, what if a kid could transform into Superman? A concept that kind of came about as the sidekick boom was happening, and heroes like Robin were being introduced, and it seemed kid characters attracted kid readers, which was largely the target demographic of comic books in those days, along with American GIs in search of escapism. For this video, I'll reflect primarily on how the character compared to the era and not really consider the modern interpretations, and as far as it goes, I think they did pretty well. I do think the child aspect is a little more downplayed for this film, seeing as they really just wanted to do a Superman film, and that kind of pulled over to the actual serial. But the general idea is kind of there. Kid ends up on an adventure somehow, and turns into ostensively Superman to help him find his way out of trouble when it arises. Honestly reminds me a bit of a mix of Tintin, a popular French comic, and Superman, and I think that was translated well enough here. Whitey Murphy was a friend of Billy's in the film and was one of the rare occurrences a character was pulled from the films into the comics, with the film premiering in March 1941 and Whitey's first appearance being Wiz Comics 22, happening in October of that year. Can we just talk about how crazy it was that this film was shooting less than a year after Captain Marvel's brand was created? Like, damn, they picked it up fast. Finally, you have Luther Bentley, or the Scorpion, who's a masked villain planning to harness the Infinity Stones, the lenses of the Golden Scorpion, to, I guess, make a super weapon since it has a super laser capabilities, I guess. There are many villains named the Scorpion over the years. Spider-Man's Mac Gargan, for example, at Marvel, but DC has a fair amount, including a Western character, a Blackhawk's villain, a Hunchback villain, and more. But never another Captain Marvel villain named the Scorpion, though he briefly appeared in a children's book back in the 1940s, The Scorpion Returns, part of a series of dime action books made for kids, which I guess you could consider kind of novellas, I don't know. I have one from the Fantastic Four and one from Batman that came out years and years ago. They are more or less like old school junior novels, mostly text but with a few pictures in there too. Captain Marvel, or Billy Batson, in this film is a superhero who just kind of stumbles into the superhero powers and immediately accepts the fact. Being that this is a 12-part adventure serial, the narrative doesn't really stop to give him much urgency. The setup of the plot is like a 5-minute intro, then a 6-minute set piece, followed by a cliffhanger, which makes determining a character arc pretty hard. He gets his powers after a brief introduction into the plot, and then from there, he's just Captain Marvel. No need to train or ponder. This is just his life now, I guess. Betty is the female damsel that occasionally gets in trouble via being captured or in a perilous death trap. You get the idea. Whitey is the friend, and all the other scientists are more or less just on the suspect lists, with Luther Bentley ultimately being the Scorpion, who's a criminal mastermind looking for the Golden Scorpion as a means to, shoot lasers. The Scorpion is worshipped by the native population, but they murder him when it turns out he's just some crusty old white dude. The tone of this is very much a whodunit, a modern example being like a Knives Out or something. Everyone's a suspect, and it's up to Billy to find out who it is as a hook to keep people coming back for each part of the show. The action is of course dated since the movie was shot 85 years ago, but it's still fun and the suspense is there and built into the narrative very well. It has some darker moments, I guess, with some death and turmoil, but ultimately the idea of the narrative is just to have fun watching Captain Marvel kick some ass for a few hours. Cy Feuer did the music on this film and was a musician who primarily worked in the theater. Like the plays, not the movies. He won a Tony Lifetime Achievement Award and did a vast amount of projects, some not even cataloged. He's probably most famous for having produced the film Cabaret, which was nominated for Best Picture. The music's pretty good. It's a very standard adventure serial type of feel. with lots of exciting moments, good setups, and atmosphere for the world. We don't actually have a credited editor on the project, but William Whitey and John English co-directed the project. William Whitey started working on serials before pretty naturally moving over to TV, following TV replacing the serial. He did lots of Dick Tracy, Lone Ranger, and Zorro serials, working in films of this vein quite a bit. John English worked on a lot of westerns and was also a semi-notable editor. The film is edited pretty well with quick action, breakneck exposition. It's certainly not boring despite it being pretty old-fashioned by today's standards. The cliffhangers are usually strong, though some are kind of laughable, like when Captain Marvel's put in a death trap and the serial's like, "You think Captain Marvel's gonna die?" And then he just walks it off since he's fucking invincible, which we all knew anyways. William Nobles did the cinematography, and it's a fairly static, set-heavy black and white film. Back in the day, cameras and film were so cumbersome, there was only so much you could do with the technology, but given the time period, it looks pretty okay. It's not shot like shit, which is pretty much what one could say positively about a film of this time. In terms of stuff that aged poorly, the native stuff is moderately racist here and there. The Turban Man in Billy's Party was the red herring character, and I think the audience was also supposed to think the guy was sneaky as hell. Like, what was he hiding under that turban?
The sign of the scorpion.
Where did you get it?
At Carlyle's. I was going through his study in the hope of finding a clue.
Also, there was a Japanese man in episode 4, and that rarely ends well in this era. Of course, he was a traitor and followed some tropes of the era, but at least it wasn't yellowface, and they casted an actual Japanese American, which is a plus, I suppose. As far as it goes, this film could have been much, much more racist. We are gonna get to the Batman 1943 film pretty soon here. Now, I know it's hard to give brownie points to a film for only being slightly racist, but hey, definitely could be worse. Some other noteworthy things: the guy who played the wizard, Nigel D. Bruler, was pretty good. He looks like an old wizard. I do think that Billy's meeting was a little awkward, like why are they standing 2 feet apart?
Captain Marvel, and take on the virtues you see recorded there.
I also think it's cool seeing the world of the 1940s and kind of seeing the golden age of comics brought to life, which is an interesting mix of simple stories but also shockingly cutting of the times. I love the old serial trope for fight scenes, which was just people in a room smashing dummy furniture over each other's heads, and there's plenty of that here. It's a charming trope, even if it's a bit cheap looking by today's standards. It's not like modern superhero films. Shazam isn't throwing a car, but he'll sure as hell throw some poorly assembled chairs at someone. The costumes, as I said, are pretty meh. The Captain Marvel logo on the suit looks stupid. It seemed pretty whipped together. You know, they could have just cut it out better and sewed it on. Not sure why it's this little logo. Also, the Scorpion has an awful suit. Look, I'm not expecting much, but why did they embroider scorpions over his nipples? That seemed a little bit odd. It looks like he's getting groped. I also don't get why they didn't just destroy the Scorpion from the start, or at least when the Scorpion started killing people. For whatever reason, they divided out the pieces. The Golden Scorpion MacGuffin could make gold or be used as a super weapon, but Billy and all the researchers didn't really seem interested in that. Perhaps, give it to the government or put it back. I'm not sure, but I don't think the best solution was to divide out the pieces and then have this mystery go on. But despite the convolution, that is kind of what the serial needed to have a plot, so whatever, I guess. The setup is definitely very convoluted, but meh. Overall, it's solid enough for what it is. It is dated for sure, but it's basically just a detective film with some Captain Marvel hijinks. The fight scenes, set pieces, and cliffhangers keep the dopamine rolling, plus it feels like a historical film, in part because it was breaking ground in the field of comic book superhero films, but also because it's actually pretty much a golden age comic book put to screen. Back in the day, comics rarely featured large epic stories. It was just a hero fighting gangsters or criminals, whatever. Occasionally, a costume villain would show up, and when they did, they were pretty much just gangsters that dressed weird. It's entertaining, not totally repulsive by today's standards, and the mystery is alright. Is it a masterpiece? No. But for a film serial, I think it's one that's worth checking out if you're curious on the origin of the superhero film genre. Spy Smasher isn't a character I remember all that much growing up. He was such a relic of World War II that even his fairly well-designed costume couldn't lead him to any long-term following, and he is a character rarely brought up by DC these days. With his Golden Age comics so rarely reprinted, I could probably count the number of Spy Smasher stories I've read on one hand. And I think the story I did read was the first appearance on some Comicsology Golden Age compilation. Those are always interesting, by the way. But you can read a lot of his stuff free online, since the issues are largely in the public domain these days. I do remember when I was younger, probably around 2010, there was a community of mostly much older than I comic collectors who would collect gold, silver, and Bronze Age comics and show what they would get. And I don't know if these people were Jordan Belmont or just had a crippling addiction to comic books, but some of these dudes spent hundreds or thousands per month on comic books. Of course, I threw my hat in the ring a bit, collecting old issues, primarily dirt poor condition or coverless stuff like the first Batgirl, Aquaman 1, the first Mary Marvel, Moon Knight, Darkseid, and more being some of my gems. Anyways, I bring this up because some guy who I was moderately friends with had his YouTube icon as Spy Smasher, and he collected these comics and knew some of the lore. That man was very into a specific niche of comic collecting. Anyways, his name escapes me, but shout out that guy. But that is largely how I know anything of this lost to time character. Spy Smasher was another Republic serial, again based on a Fawcett Comics character, as Captain Marvel was before. Spy Smasher, not too dissimilar to superhero films of today, was pretty expensive, being Republic's most expensive serial of 1942. The film, like Captain Marvel, would be directed by William Whitney, and would be one of fucking 5 movies that he'd direct that year. They had him working around the clock, apparently. Spy Smasher, or Alan Armstrong, is a masked spy vigilante that works undercover to foil schemes. He isn't associated with the United States government, though, as the government in real life had yet to enter World War II, not doing so until 8 months after this film hit theaters. That isn't that important, but Alan has found some Nazi activity in France and is set to be executed, but manages to escape, fleeing back to the United States. Anyways, Alan faked his death and returns to meet his twin brother Jack, who was like, "Damn, I thought you died, bro." Anyways, the super Nazi spy, the Mask, starts meddling around in America, and Spy Smasher intends to stop him. The Mask has all kind of schemes. In one, he plans to flood America's economy with fake money, crashing the GDP and causing massive inflation. Imagine how fucked up it would be if the American people had to pay $2.75 for a McChicken or even $7 for a Taco Bell $5 meal box. He also tries some good old sabotage, so on and so on. Jack, Alan's brother, while pretending to be Spy Smasher, falls to his death, and the Germans are blown up by a mine at the end of the film. Spy Smasher first appeared in Whiz Comics 2 from 1940, the same issue that saw Captain Marvel introduced, with the character largely unchanged from the comics. He's a guy who fights evil spies, pretty simple. He remained largely unchanged, though Jack Armstrong, his twin brother, was 100% made up for this film. His love interest from the comics, Eve Corby, was for some reason matched up with Jack instead. The Mask also originated in Whiz Comics number 2 and was one of Spy Smasher's primary villains. The only reason this is somewhat odd is, as you'll soon notice, these serials never really use villains from the comics, opting to make their own typically. His story is similar to the film, being a guy who keeps butting heads with Spy Smasher and is an evil Nazi man. In the comic, the Mask is a man of many disguises, much like the master of disguise himself.
Open the sesame! Open the sesame!
Alan Armstrong is Spy Smasher. Much like Captain Marvel in his film Serial, the character isn't really that deep. He faked his death as a means of becoming anonymous and returns to America to meet with his twin brother. He hates Nazis and the Axis, and despite America dodging war, Spy Smasher would join the war effort in his own way. Otherwise, he punches, he kicks, he makes incredible leaps in logic to surmise plans and stop them before they can harm Allied interests or before it could cause catastrophe on U.S. soil. You kind of get the gist. Jack Armstrong is his twin brother, who was primarily added to die since they used the character for a cliffhanger where Spy Smasher seemingly dies.
I'm not Spy Smasher, Eve. My brother Alan is.
Otherwise, he just bounces off Spy Smasher, and the duo makes some small talk throughout the film about what's going on. Eve Corby is Jack's fiancée and the daughter of Admiral Corby. She's the love interest and is eventually sad that her fiancé died. The Mask is your average Nazi villain who appears in costume fairly rarely. He's acting in the Nazis' best interests, trying to find and sabotage the United States by any means necessary to weaken them and keep them out of the war. Simple but effective for a story like this, I suppose. The music in this film was done by Mort Glickman, who for seemingly no reason bit part of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony for the main score, which is pretty weird and instantly recognizable. Even if you don't know the song, if you hear it, you'd probably recognize it. Otherwise, the music is just ambient violins and whatnot, as all of these are. Edward Todd and Tony Martinelli edited this project, and the editing is good enough. Still pretty static, as was common for the era, but it hits a pretty nice pace over its 12 parts, and despite being over 3 hours long, keeps your attention pretty well, so I managed to sit through it in one sitting without the film being a total drag to watch. Cinematography was done by Reggie Lanning, who at the time was doing 10 or more projects a year, and it is shot competently, but as I will reiterate with all these film serials, they really just set down the camera and let stuff unfold as it would unfold. Dollies, handhelds, and more were impossible at the time due to the lack of technology, and they were also not super practical given the fact that filmmakers would need to do more setups, and that was time they didn't really have filming these serials. Hence the action and fight scenes being very static and not as dramatic or exciting as your modern action film. You may start noticing suited white dudes are often the villains in these films, and that plays extra here since the mask is rarely actually behind a mask. And as with a lot of these films, hired henchmen are just dudes in suits that the hero in question beats down. This is pretty standard for the era, so it's not really a complaint. Hell, even the costume henchman of the comics is more of a relic of the Silver Age of the comics, with most dudes up till and a bit through, than just being random suited men. The stunts in this film look super dangerous too often. Characters will just climb a 30-foot set that's clearly held together with thin plywood and painted to look like something else. It almost gives me vertigo to watch. Yeah, it's not some calculated pyrotechnics, and there isn't Tom Cruise climbing the world's tallest building or something, but the fact that they're so slapdash is almost worse. A planned car jump with a professional driver who's rehearsed the jump, a team of engineers to design the ramps, and physicists to let the driver know what he needs to do, and sometimes the cars are even remote controlled, is a hell of a lot safer than a dude fumbling around a plywood set 35 feet over concrete in a sweaty leather costume that he can barely see out of. The film has more superhero action than Captain Marvel, which is nice, but a concise, overarching narrative beyond foiling the Mask's various schemes is not here, making it even less to invest in than the admittedly shallow-plotted Captain Marvel, which is a bit of a mixed blessing. I definitely think the Spy Smasher costume works better than a lot of the superhero suits of the day, with no complex logos or complex things like Batman's ears to worry about, though I find the Mask's costume being a hanky in front of his face a bit comical. I suppose it was also a bit economical as well, though. Overall, Spy Smasher is okay. The action is fun, the story is pretty much non-existent, but despite this, the film is just fun, dangerous stunt after dangerous stunt. and it captures the Golden Age comics well, and despite my minuscule knowledge on the character himself, I have read enough Golden Age stuff over the years to know this captured that masked vigilante comic book vibe well from the era, which I suppose is what really counts overall. I think the theme song choice was a bit weird, but I think the editing and cinematography are solid for what the film is. I think this is definitely one of the more worthwhile serials to check out, along with its cousin film, The Adventures of Captain Marvel. Spy Smasher, as I said, was Republic's most expensive serial of the year, and would be the second and last serial based on Fawcett Publications, with the rest of the serials following DC characters proper, aside from Blackhawk, which pulled its material from Quality Comics, a company much like Fawcett that would eventually be pulled into the DC universe down the line. The film costed $154,000, or about $3 million in 2025 money. Retrospectively, people think this was an impressive serial from the stunts and action perspective, and thought it was pretty solid for what it is, with the serial eventually being trimmed into an 100-minute feature film in the late 60s during the Batman TV show-led superhero boom, entitled Spy Smasher Returns, though what he returns from I don't know, since this is the only Spy Smasher film ever produced. This would be the last live-action film based on Fawcett characters until 2019 Shazam film that was set in the DCEU that I conveniently already made a retrospective on with its sequel as well, so check those out on my channel. Oof. The Batman serial is really something. I remember getting this film's pseudo-sequel, Batman and Robin, from 1948 at the fucking Office Max when I was a kid. That is how I was initially introduced to the world of movie serials, not realizing at the time there was anything older than the 1966 Batman film, which I found on the Netflix app on my buddy's Wii back in like 2008 or something. So since this film wasn't available on that app, and my local Office Max failed to save a copy of this film for me, I used the trusty Netflix disc mailing service to have this one sent over to my house, and I haven't watched it since. I guess that was about a decade and a half ago, so I didn't really remember the film in all honesty. Now that I'm doing this series, I watched it again, and yeah, I can see why this one is largely left as a passing mention, if mentioned at all now, in the robust history of the Cape Crusader in film. The film is the first Batman movie ever, as well as the first proper DC Universe film, then National Publications, with the previous two films we covered in this series actually starting at Fawcett Publications back when those films were produced. As a result, these films were actually created by Columbia Pictures, rather than Republic Pictures, which teamed up with Fawcett back in the day on Shazam and Spy Smasher. At the time, Columbia Pictures was actually kind of a B studio, and when compared to Republic, it was making smaller, more cheaply made serials, with much of their material not really lasting the test of time, bar their run on the Three Stooges, which is largely considered a highlight of their early filmography. Down the line, they would be acquired by Sony Pictures, and most recently have been living off their bread and butter Spider-Man films, which largely carries the company these days. But back then, they were about turning and burning quick, cheap content for a buck. This film is actually pretty racist, reflecting on the anti-Japanese propaganda of the era, with narration positively talking about the Japanese internment, frequent use of now frowned upon slurs against the Japanese, and having a main villain which is a white guy, J. Carrol Naish, who famously did cheap impersonations of minorities of all kinds. He was a supposed dialect specialist who liked wearing distasteful makeup. He was typecasted in these roles and played virtually every ethnicity you could think of. In reality, he was Irish, but would come to be a bit upset everyone preferred his racist characters to his earnest roles as an Irishman. I don't really know how to follow up that history, but that's what happened. The film was pretty cheap, and despite the Batmobile premiering a few years earlier in 1941, the film opted to just use a Cadillac 61, figuring it'd be a little easier than trying to dress up a car. The film opted to shoot in California rather than attempt to use an eastern city as a Gotham stand-in, as it is often portrayed in the comics. It would have added cost to drive the cast and crew across the country and secure permits, so they figured what's better than good old LA to be the face of Gotham City. This is one of the few times in film this was the case. The plot follows, as you can imagine, Batman and Robin. This isn't an origin and just jumps right into the action. Who, in the wake of Pearl Harbor, work with America to foil Japanese terrorism on the home front. This is when they learn Linda Page, Batman's love interest, had her uncle kidnapped, likely by an undercover Japanese operative, which of course was correct. The ringleader of the group, Dr. Daka, is trying to create his own ray gun, which he hopes will bring the US to its knees. Though, the only material that can power it is radium. Not uranium, radium. A brief aside to anyone who knows even a bit about this stuff, and I don't claim to be an expert by any means, but you should know that radium is basically just really old uranium past its half-life that won't do much more than glow and give you a bunch of cancer. Regardless, it's what Dr. Daka wants, and he eventually gains some access to it, though he also has a side hustle of capturing people, bringing them into his racist anti-Japanese circus ride and putting them in a special chair that makes them into mindless zombies he can control.
A Jap!
It is useless for you to struggle. My zombies are too strong, even for a superior person like yourself to cope with.
A second side note, zombies at this time weren't the brain eaters we know today. That was an invention of George Romero in the 60s. Back then it was basically just a word for like a ghoul or something. And what a zombie was kind of varied creator to creator. Anyways, this all goes back and forth until Linda is captured by Daka, and Batman finally infiltrates the weird amusement park ride, defeating Daka, who tries to kamikaze attack Batman, which leads to his own death. You may recall, if you follow my superhero film videos, that I've already talked about Batman and Robin's origins. Well, I'll do it again, primarily because I want to talk about how they contrast to the comic books up to this point, and not really talk about modern Batman history so much. Batman first appeared in Detective Comics 27 from 1939 and was one of the first comic book superheroes. This film came out 4 years later in 1943 and had only that first 4 years to work off, though. Batman had already gone through one major change in that time, going from a solo, brooding vigilante with some supernatural elements to the more fun-loving, criminal-beating sociopath that first appeared in Detective Comics 38, the issue Robin was introduced in. The reason I say sociopath is that Batman really liked murdering people early on, and there are more than one issue in this era where someone is sentenced to death in the electric chair or something, and Batman is just gassed that this adversary's brain got fried. Regardless, I sort of see more elements of the original in this first Lewis Wilson portrayal, one that is actually fairly true to the comics of the day. I will say the costume's pretty bad, but you can't really win them all, and they didn't know how to make those ears work on the mask back in the day with these cloth costumes. Robin, meanwhile, first appeared in Detective Comics 38 and was Batman's sidekick, made to appeal to kids, and much like Dick Grayson in the comics, was largely a kid for the criminals to beat the hell out of for Batman to save and occasionally save Batman. Douglas Croft, who played Robin, was only 16 at the time, making him probably the closest we've seen to an accurate Robin. With modern Hollywood restrictions, it's pretty hard to have an actual teenager in the role.
You should use your full name. I like that name. Robin. Thanks.
He was pretty solid in the role, and I thought he did a good job. Prince Daka was an original character and wouldn't appear in the comics for years, but perhaps being Batman's first on-screen foe led to some curiosity that would eventually see the character make it to the page in a couple modern appearances. First coming to the comics in All-Star Squadron 42 from 1985, a book taking place in Earth 2, despite the current main Earth being Earth 1 at the time. I'm not going to go too much into that, but he fought the All-Star Squadron, and later in 2020 he'd be introduced to the modern continuity in the one-shot DC's Crimes of Passion #1 as a hypnotist villain in a short story. Finally, you have Linda Page as the damsel in distress and love interest of Batman, who originated in Batman 5 from 1941, being Batman's second ever full love interest after Julie Madison left the line, and with Catwoman mostly being used as a one-off flirtation at that point in the series. In the film, she pretty much plays the same role, just kind of a damsel. Not much has really changed on her front. This film, like the other films, is pretty shallow in characterizations. Batman is a hero of Gotham and rich, overly concerned social figure by day. It's not so different from the comics. It is quite accurate, but much like the comics of the day, the superhero themselves was just kind of a means to an end on telling a crime story. He works with the American government in this film, and as a result is deeply patriotic, which also means for the day he deeply hated Japanese people, which looks really bad upon reflection.
Step back.
Are you Jap devil?
Dick Grayson is Robin, Batman's ward, who he's a little too close with, given it's some kid who he adopted that is nearing adulthood. Though while you may assume Bruce is grooming the boy, the true nature of their closeness is actually that they're fellow Japanese-hating superheroes. Hooray, I guess. Prince Daka is a Japanese spy that hits all the stereotypes you'd expect. He's sneaky, cowardly, and evil, heartless, mad scientist guy. As is the nature of propaganda, there is no earnest take on Daka. He knows he's evil, he knows his cronies are American traitors, and he thinks Japan should rule the world with an iron fist. Villains are very rarely deep in this era. It's just a little harder to stomach when it is now terribly, terribly dated. Not to mention a character that would be the first rogue of what would become a landmark in both film and pop culture, like Batman. He makes this film an awkward watch, and despite good performances from Lewis Wilson and Douglas Croft as Batman and Robin respectively, I think the people largely discount this film entirely, since it's admittedly a watch that constantly one-ups itself in the things the characters do and say, as a result of this villain being so deeply rooted in hateful propaganda. Tonally, this film is definitely an adventure serial with some fun setups. Batman is on a plane punching out bad guys, but for some reason the plane has car steering wheels. I can't fathom how that works. Everything is quick and bombastic and fun, with stunts much like Spy Smasher that just look so dangerous. Not because some huge ball of fire engulfs a car in a calculated stunt, but because it's like, okay, 16-year-old Douglas Croft, just hang from that poorly constructed copper piping from 30 feet up until we yell cut, and try not to break your legs on the way down. Like, it's just crazy in how unsafe it all looks. The music is kind of your generic but exciting piece of orchestral scoring. Nothing too crazy. It's done by Lee Zoller, who composed a lot of stuff from the 20s to 40s. Not bad. He was just whipping out like 10 movies per year, and it feels a bit formulaic as a result, but it gets the job done. Dwight Caldwell and Earl Turner edited the piece, and it's well enough edited. Both sides did lots of serials, and it's your kind of run-of-the-mill cut across 4 exposition scenes to get to a stunt setup, and then cut it off for the conclusion in the next episode. Simple, streamlined, and mostly solid for what it is. It follows the formula well. James S. Brown Jr. did the cinematography, and perhaps it's the Prince aging over the years, but damn, the saturation is often pretty messy. Batcave scenes are somehow overlit and look oversaturated, making Batman reflect and make it hard to see him. With rooftop and outdoor sets being way too dark, more standard sets in offices or living rooms and stuff look fine, but the saturation is just kind of weird on this film. With that said, I would muster a guess and say the original negative is gone, and we're watching these films through a decently preserved copy that is the best we'll ever see. Alright, other notes. I like that Batman's Batcave has a sitting desk and 2 cuck chairs, and that's it. Nothing snazzy. Doesn't even park the car down there. This looks like some shit some teenager would set up if they lived near a cave to smoke pot and drink White Claws at. This film has a narrator, and the man is patriotic, as you can imagine, in a racist film. Films don't need narrators, though, if they do their job right. Don't mind it for opening titles, but I don't like when I'm being walked through shit. Just show me it. Batman puts stickers on criminals' heads. This was a nod to Zack Snyder's famous branding from Batman v Superman, Dawn of Justice.
He branded him.
A wonderful reference to that wonderful 2016 film.
You'll recognize these as the last 2 men of the Collins gang. I know you've been looking for them for some time. The Batman.
I think director Lambert Hillier just looked into the future and knew Batman would leave his mark in Batman v Superman and decided to copy that. Batman and Robin aren't really experts. They just kind of jump gangsters and get lucky. Part 1, for example, 3 guys combine forces and thrash Batman and Robin. I'm not saying I would do much better, but this is a far cry from the guy who fights like Darkseid, Bane, or even the Joker. This Batman can scrap with some success. That is his superpower. They scared Alfred by shooting a laser at him, and then they call him a giant pussy for it.
When suddenly, electrically and without warning, it was shattered. The curse of the Tottenhams!
You frighten as easily as our spineless friend downstairs.
Like, this is 1943. If I saw a laser beam, I would literally shit my pants. Hell, I'd probably shit today if I saw a giant laser beam shot at me. Alfred is kind of also a dipshit in this serial, which is sort of strange. He's not like the calm, collected voice of reason that he is in most Batman films today. This Alfred is just a goofball. I actually don't mind this film, and I say that with kind of an asterisk. It's entertaining, at least, for a few minutes, then something obscenely racist happens, and I go, oh, well that aged poorly. And then it's fine again. It's a strange mixed reaction. One second it's a great adaptation of Batman, considering the technologies of the day, and I'm having a solid time being fairly entertained. Then it goes south. I think it was really a weird period in American history, and propaganda was everywhere. Mickey Mouse had some sketchy stuff too, Popeye, and it wasn't abnormal per se, but it makes something like this, which I would say is worth a watch, with the racism removed, pretty hard to earnestly recommend these days, because there's lots of parts where you feel secondhand, embarrassment, perhaps shame. And I mean, America was throwing Japanese people in prison camps at the time. It was a horrible time to be a Japanese person in America, and yeah, this kind of makes it a weird watch today to be like, these people are evil and terrible. America wasn't doing much better. And watching it reflected today in such earnest and just kind of like excited to hate Japanese people is just bizarre to me. It's hard to watch. This would be it for Lewis Wilson and Douglas Croft as Batman and Robin, but a pseudo-sequel would drop 5 years later titled Batman and Robin, with the new Batman and Robin in the masks, and a totally different storyline, meaning Columbia definitely had some interest in going back to the franchise a few years later, and at the time, the film fared pretty well critically, but by the 70s, historians decided the film was a bit overrated, and more modern critics consider it basically an unwatchable propaganda film with little value behind the historical aspect of this being Batman's first film, though balancing that against the racism, making it a pretty hard watch. So the first 3 serials we covered were superhero films, but since I'm reviewing every DC serial, I guess that means for completion I have to review this film too, huh? Hop Harrigan isn't a superhero, he's an ace pilot. I think today comics kind of have this stigma as an exclusively superhero genre, and while that's certainly the majority of comics today, back in the 1940s especially, comics came in a lot of shades, and while superheroes were popular, so too was war comics, romance comics, horror comics, and general action comics like Hop Harrigan was. These days, most DC films are based on superheroes, though it's worth noting that exceptions to this rule have come throughout the history of the company and their many cinematic adaptations. V for Vendetta, A History of Violence, and the Red films are just a few examples of DC Comics properties that were adapted, not revolving around DC superheroes necessarily. Hop Harrigan is a DC character who today isn't very famous, but to put in perspective why this movie was produced back in 1946, we must note that Hop Harrigan in the 40s, much like Superman, ballooned in popularity both in the comics as well as on radio. Kind of the pre-TV set form of leisure entertainment back in the day, with the show running for 4 years and being fairly popular. With the show at its peak apparently receiving over 100,000 fan letters in 1 month, which is pretty much the only viewership statistics we have for an 80-year-old radio program. And how accurate that statistic is pretty hard to prove as well, though based on the amount of time on the air along with the serial it helped produce, probably lends to the fact that at least at first it was a relatively popular show. The story of this serial is pretty meandering, but the long and short is Hop Harrigan runs an airport he rents out with his buddy Tank, with hangers-on Gail and her younger aviation-obsessed brother Jackie. They're hired to take a pack of mercenaries to bring Dr. Tobar to his lab, where the guy is generating sun-powered energy. They fly, they wander around a boring tarmac set, but eventually We learn of an ace pilot, the chief pilot, who kidnaps Dr. Tobar. More boring shit ensues. Then Dr. Tobar decides to use his invention to literally blow up the entire planet Earth, and Hop Harrigan and his 3 buddies decide to assassinate him since for some reason the military and police don't want to see what this crazed mad scientist is up to after such an arrogant threat.
You'd better stay here and tell us how to make it the rest of the way.
But we're there.
We're not in yet.
Yeah, and there's that trick door.
Hop Harrigan, as I said, was a popular show on the radio, but as we're talking about the character in my DC Serials series, he naturally started in the comics, first appearing in All American Comics issue 1 in 1939. All American Comics was a pretty unremarkable comic series for a while until it created the original Green Lantern and would be canceled as that character lost popularity. And even in Green Lantern's own book, the main character became a dog. Streak the Wonder Dog, to be specific. With Green Lantern issue 36 boldly not even featuring Green Lantern himself on the cover, instead replacing him with Streak the Wonder Dog. This, I guess, furthers my explanation that superheroes started to kind of go out of popularity around 1946 when this movie was made. You may ask how this loops back around to Hop Harrigan. Well, honestly, it doesn't really. I just need to make something of this video so it's longer than 3 minutes, so I chose to drop an obscure fact on you guys, so deal with it. Tank also first appeared in All American Comics issue 1. In the film, he was comic relief and buddy of Hop, a remarkable mechanic who's goofy. In the comics, he's pretty much the same. Nothing really changed here. Seems pretty similar from my understanding, but I won't pretend to be some sort of huge Hop head by any means. Those are the only 2 people in the film actually adapted from the comics. Hop Harrigan is the lead of this film and is an ace pilot who found himself in a plot to stop Dr. Torbon's death laser. I literally can't think of anything else to say. Tank is another lead in this film and is an ace mechanic who found himself in a plot to stop Dr. Torbon's death laser. He's pretty goofy. Gale is the female lead of the film and is a woman who found herself in a plot to stop Dr. Torbon's death laser. I literally can't think of anything else to say. Jackie Nolan is the child lead of the film and is the brother of Gale, who also found himself in a plot to stop Dr. Torbon's death laser. Dr. Torbon is based. He's literally just a doctor at first, and then he makes his invention into a death laser, and perhaps I fell asleep or something, but for some reason he just wants to annihilate the entire world with his doomsday weapon, even destroying a whole planet to test the thing. I like this. I think a lot of superhero films, or just films in general, put too much exposition and an explanation on villains' motivations. Not the Hop Harrigan film, though. Dr. Torbon wants to obliterate the entire fucking world just to be an asshole. There isn't really anything else to say, and there's really not anything else that deep here. I mean, it's fair. I have copped out on this video quite a bit, but no one's gonna watch it anyways, and I'm gonna continue to cop out when talking about the tone of this movie because the only thing that comes to mind is boring. The film is just a few characters taking their turns chatting on a tarmac, and then the film cuts to a flight scene, which is disorienting usually, a mix of poorly shot flight footage and some stuff in first-person view, all shot to totally nauseate the viewer. I think if you put out a movie about planes and it fails at its primary goal, which is to show airplanes, then you're kind of cooked. The movie is mostly carefree, I suppose, even the final part, which admittedly is hilarious, but only made more surreal if you watch the preceding 4.5 hours. It's kind of an odd ramp up. Hop and the other 3 characters just kind of casually bring guns to shoot down Dr. Torbon in his base, since it's just an accepted fact by the world that he's going to blow up the entire planet, which nobody wants to deal with except for Hop and his 3 buddies.
Well, we're in the elevator. There is no elevator. It's just another of Tobor's tricks. It's only a sound effect.
On top of that, he kind of just wanders in, shoots him, and the movie's immediately over.
It's a lucky thing the doors were open, because that last blast blew us right out of the place.
And overall, it just makes for a both anticlimactic and yet over-the-top conclusion to a film that is very loosely about flying airplanes. The music was fairly unmemorable, supposedly done by Lee Zoller, but in the traces of his biography I could dig up, I see no reference to him having done this film beyond credits exclusively on the film's Wikipedia page. The music, whether done by Lee Zeller or someone else, was serviceable, but in service of such a nothing, long film that it's hard to start getting very complimentary towards it. The editing is also pretty weak, done by Earl Turner. The problem is, as I discussed, the flying. It's so bad, as we already covered a bit. Much of the rest of the film is just cutting really standard cuts between various people on a tarmac. I really can't say anything impressive about it, but the flying scenes are so astronomically bad in this airplane movie, I have a hard time giving credit to this film enough to call it serviceable. Though this all could be partially blamed on the director Derwin Abrams or cinematography Ira H. Morgan, and man, Ira didn't have a super hard job. 99% of this film is sitting statically in rooms or on tarmacs. Sometimes they go to one of the Columbia sets, like the rooftop we just saw in the Batman serial. Also, the print I watched was a bit washed, but whatever, it probably looked better on an earlier print, I don't know. I think it's more of film aids than anything, because this looks even more abysmal than the Batman film did. It is also definitely a VHS rip, since some of this footage needed to be cropped to get rid of that nice low-fi VHS scrubbing off the bottom. I also hit down the darkness and up the saturation, all shit I couldn't do on my DVD, sadly. I'll try to be positive. At least the planes weren't steered with car steering wheels like in the Batman serial. And this thing in the final part where a mountain blows up was a pretty fun effect, even though it was clearly just a mound of dirt with dynamite buried under it or something, but it looks neat. The film is ultimately a 5-hour piece about people sitting around on a boring tarmac with really boring drama, villains, and effects. The villain feels the same as Batman's, just with less urgency, and sees a lot less play. The last 3 parts pretty much just turns into the Batman serial, with some of the same sets and everything. The planes are pretty much just dropped, and a full 3.5 hours into the film, the plot starts going. Shots and moments just drone on. It's so utterly dull. I will say the last part is really, really funny and over the top compared to what we saw before, which is something, I suppose. I think Dr. Tobar as a villain, wanting to literally explode the entire world, is something. I like how it's just Hop and his buddies going, despite the newspapers writing about it, and it just being a known fact to everyone in the world. This is not some secret mission Hop is on. He openly says, I'm going to fucking kill everybody.
Soon we'll turn it all on, in every direction, until it covers the entire world.
No military, no police, just 4 dudes with guns. They're also very calm on their mission.
We're after a guy that's gonna blow up the world.
Some people will do anything for a fast ride.
He's on the level. Let's go.
Where to?
Where you found him.
And then the doctor and the henchmen are just kind of shot up and the whole death machine blows up. The climax might be 25 seconds long. There's a 5-second intro where they talk about world peace or whatever, and then a static end screen. It's so bizarre, I don't know.
I give up.
Oh, Tank.
Hop Harrigan is such a scam. This film couldn't have done well. Part of the serial's objective is to have viewers come back week by week and pay to get back in. I can't imagine this really happened with this film. If there's any evidence of this, we need not look forward than the legacy of Hop Harrigan. 5 months after this film came out, the radio show would end unceremoniously in August 1946. Hop would keep going in the comics for a while, but following All American Comics 99, his character would be discontinued, I assume in favor of Green Lantern's dog, if we're judging solely off the cover of this final issue. Hop Harrigan would cameo in the modern Prime Earth DC continuity, but the character is largely a relic born in the Golden Age where he would remain, withering into obscurity forevermore. Vigilante is a serial that is such a fun idea, but kind of dies due to the format. I found myself enjoying the concept and the setup, but really falling off of the film as it dragged closer and closer to the conclusion at around the 5-hour mark. He is a hero that's kind of fun in concept, but one that really doesn't have enough to him to warrant the amount of time a serial devours. Following work on Batman and Hop Harrigan, Columbia continued its partnership with National Comics, or DC as we know it today, pulling out another hero that was marginally popular at the time with Vigilante. Though you may know Vigilante from the Peacemaker TV series today, this version of the character is much different, being a Western and cowboy-themed superhero and being considered an entirely different legacy lineage, technically unrelated to the one that has recently taken on more popularity with the TV show. A notable and I think slightly surprising change is that Vigilante had a Chinese sidekick in the comics, Stuff the Chinatown Kid. For this film, he was aged up and played by George Offerman Jr., and is also notably just a white guy. Though honestly, if you watch my Batman portion of this video, this was probably the most tasteful thing to our modern sensibilities that we could possibly ask for. It was either whitewashing or most likely a horribly distasteful stereotype. We'll talk more about this guy as we get into the characters, but that was probably the only real notable point behind the scenes that was worth pointing out. Not much happened here, or at least not much is written. Greg Sanders is a Hollywood film actor by day, starring in westerns and stuff, but at night he is the Vigilante, a government agent. When a Prince Hamel comes from his vaguely Arabic land of Arvania and gives white horses to a number of people along with the arrival of the strange blood red pearls, or just the blood pearls as they call them. Anyhow, a gang X arrives and steals the horses off people. We eventually learn that these blood pearls are inside the horseshoes, and the prince's aide was planning on smuggling them through these horses to sell to the evil gang leader X1.
Tell those to whom horses were given, there is curse on them.
Anyhow, the movie plays out from here a lot like the adventures of Captain Marvel. It spins its wheels as shit happens, leading to a cliffhanger until the Vigilante finally confronts the masked man X1, who turns out to be George Pierce, one of the guys that's kind of peripherally in the story. Greg thought he was his friend, but I guess not. The Vigilante, or Greg Sanders, later Greg Saunders, first appeared in Action Comics 42 as a backup story in the Superman-led series. In the comics, he is the son of a cop and grandson of a legendary Native American warrior who uses his lineage and ties to the American West to become a cowboy-themed vigilante. In the comics, he's also a country singer. Though this film took it a step further and also made him a famous film actor, implying that he's probably mostly based in Los Angeles, which, as I said previously, is convenient from a filming standpoint, kind of like how Gotham just became LA in the Batman serials. So the part of him being a drifting superhero country singer was largely dropped, though the character is mostly pretty accurate otherwise. He's a modern cowboy. That is the character at his core. In the comics, he's also part of superhero teams the All-Star Squadron and the Seven Soldiers of Victory, occasionally crossing over with teams like the Justice Society and even more rarely the Justice League. Vigilante was primarily a hero in the 40s, which is also the time period he operated in the modern lore as well, though he even fairly recently fought the One Who Laughs Joker with a team of superheroes, so unlike Hop Harrigan, I will say Vigilante at least has some level of modern reference to his name. Stuff, or the Chinatown Kid, first appeared 3 issues later in Action Comics 45 in 1942, which isn't all that shocking since characters like Captain America, Green Arrow, Batman, and other non-powered heroes had a trend of getting sidekicks around this time. As I said, in this film, stuff is no longer Chinese, which isn't all that surprising, and I think his role as a sidekick was also downplayed a bit from what I know of the comics iteration. Though stuff in this film occasionally bounces off of Vigilante to give the character someone to talk to. Largely, though, I think they weren't all that interested in the character, so his adaptation is very loose, to say the least. The Vigilante comes out the gate pretty interestingly, being a man of many talents. He's a superhero, he's a government agent, a steamed actor, and just randomly a country singer at a point as well. His origins are vague in the film, and his motivations are even vaguer. Other than people are starting to die, so he needs to suit up as the Vigilante. Though eventually I think the modern cowboy gimmick wears a little thin, especially when the other gimmicks like the country singer and the actor and stuff falls to the wayside. Eventually he's just a cowboy man, but the gimmick is just a little bit undercooked. Stuff is his sidekick, who's basically just a 20-something-year-old pal that hangs around and occasionally investigates stuff with the Vigilante. I'm torn because while I imagine the Chinatown Kid stuff would likely end up very, very racist, I also think they could have made a much more notable character than just Vigilante's slightly younger pal. I think his lack of utility makes him more or less pointless. George Pierce is X1, the story's main villain, who also gets the story started when Greg Sanders is shooting a film on his ranch. George is a nightclub owner man who just kind of is around, though soon we learn he is the masked X1 trying to steal the blood pearls from Prince Hamill and causing the Vigilante general problems and leading to all kinds of cliffhangers. Prince Hamill is an Arabic guy, and much like when Captain Marvel had an Arabic guy, I think the film is like, who is this guy and what is he hiding behind his turban? He also has a level of mysticism to him that I think was spurred on by the popularity of the 1001 Nights stories that were very popular in America at the time. Literally just watch like any 1940s media and you'll get all sorts of like this Arabic fascination that we had back in the day.
I wish these 5 horses to become an expression of my sincere gratitude for the generous treatment I received in your country. The first one I wish to present to that celebrated and talented rodeo star, Miss Betty Winslow.
Anyways, he's fine. He's pretty functional to the plot, but he's okay. Betty Winslow is the lady love interest and the damsel that's her whole story purpose, as you can imagine. They do it in all of these films. Tonally, this film is a mystery with a breezy adventure behind it, as is all of these films really. I think from a setup perspective, this film could have been pretty unique, but once the film hits the format around the third part, the film refuses to break it and play back into the strengths of the actor country singer gimmick that keeps this character from being just another Batman clone.
All day long they work the page just to throw it all away. Saturday night in San Antonio.
The film is musically not very notable. I know I say that a lot, but like the films themselves, the music has a format, and that's because the music for this film was literally from a stock library, apparently. Wallace Fox directed this movie, and it is part of his catalog of more than 80 films, and Earl Turner did the editing. From what I see, Wallace did a lot of westerns, and as such, the film was shot and edited in that style, just in the then modern day, and the western action cliches of the day are also all here. The film is put together well, but as I said, the thing is just way too long. But that is more on the format than the film itself. There is good stuff here, just not enough gas in the tank in my opinion to warrant the near 5-hour runtime that we have here. Ira H. Morgan shot the thing and it looks well enough with some pretty clear picture on the action and serviceable set shooting for exposition. Sadly, as you can probably tell from the footage in this video, the print in this film is not in the best shape these days. Though thankfully, Superman, which we'll look at next, has a pretty good print and can perhaps show what the film could have looked like if it actually had a good condition master. One thing you may notice if you're familiar with this film, and I assume there's probably not many people watching this that actually know anything about this stuff, so I think I wouldn't get caught if I didn't mention it, but I have a bootleg DVD of this thing. I don't know if they've ever sold an official DVD in my defense, but when trying to pull footage for this, I absolutely could not find the movie online, so I have part 1. That's what I was able to find.
All day long they work for pay just to throw it all away.
One thing that impressed me is that Vigilante almost had a character beyond Western superhero man, though I think that started to waver in consistency as the serial drones on part by part. The Blood Pearls plot feels a bit redundant and is a multi-piece MacGuffin like we saw in The Adventures of Captain Marvel a few serials ago, and I'm a bit disappointed his sidekick is just a boring old greaser man. The film is also really dense with action, which helps pass the time even if the action is occasionally a bit redundant and in service of a plot prone to spinning its wheels a little bit more than it should. Also, when I did my Batman serial video, I was accused of being racist or not racist enough or something. So I say this with caution, but I'll be honest. At points I have a real hard time telling all these white people apart. Like, there'll be like 4 people in the room along with Greg Sanders, and I'm just like, fuck, I don't know who's who. Which makes the mystery a little less engaging when it's hard to tell anybody apart except group of white dudes and Arabic guy. The ending is a little dumb, like a lot of these serials. All the integral plot happens in part 1 and then the final chapter, and this film is no different. Literally nothing happens in parts 2 through 14 except the occasional fight. Then finally, the Vigilante just invites everyone to dinner and surmises it must be George Pierce, then just shows up at George Pierce's place and attempts to kill the man. George Pierce as X1 also just has a shitty ass costume, as do a lot of these villains. I don't know why so many of these costumes are as bad as they just kind of are, and I guess part of it might be technology restrictions, but still. To kind of conclude this whole thing, too, it wasn't even Vigilante who kills the villain, it was just some random bodyguard to Prince Hamill, which seemed a little bit weak. Ultimately, this film lives solely on the concept, which admittedly is kind of fun. Vigilante, or at least this version, has been lost to time, but I think the singing cowboy with an alter ego that is like a John Wayne-esque Western actor that in turn has an alter ego that is a vigilante man, it's kind of fun. The film is an easy watch, but this, like a lot of serials, really lives and dies off of the first and last part, with the middle 3 hours being pretty skippable. Greg Saunders would go on to be forgotten, as this movie was, but I think this could have been so much more had the film been a bit tighter and more concise. You know, like I've said about pretty much all of these films. I do think if this film showed me anything, it gave me the idea that I think it would be kind of fun to see more Marvel and DC's Western properties get adapted. Imagine a Jonah Hex fit. Oh fuck, they made that.
About that.
Took it all, Jonah.
Well, searched you for darn good, didn't they?
Wouldn't you?
Wait, I saw that. Superman is kind of a weird character. In this era, he was pretty simple, and I think a lot of the character's charm has kind of been lost as the character started going through a roughly 50-year identity crisis. At Superman's best, he is just a guy who also happens to have godly powers and be literally invincible. But being that the character is coming up on 90 years old, creators couldn't leave well enough alone and had to make the guy very, very convoluted. That isn't to say I hate the new Superman by any means, but I think this convolution and the stereotypes of Superman as a character makes people kind of count the guy out. I think Superman works best when he's simple, so the Superman serial, or Superman 1948, or just Superman, which is decidedly as simple as it gets, is kind of amazing to me. Okay, so we talked a bit about the production as it related to the adventures of Captain Marvel a few videos ago, but to review, Republic, who made the Captain Marvel and Spy Smasher adaptations, wanted to make a Superman adaptation for a while, being forced to retool their first attempt into the film, Mysterious Dr. Satan, and then later attempted to do it again, which led to a direct cancellation. National Comics also wanted creative control over the project since Superman the brand was sort of starting to sync up across the comics, newsprints, radio, and Max Fleischer cartoons, and with everything starting to form more of a standardized template for the character. Anyhow, it sat on the shelf until it started being pitched again in the late 1940s. Some of the big dogs like Universal passed on the film since they closed up their serials division, leaving those smaller studios like Republic and Columbia to fight over the scraps. Republic was actually offered the first chance to make the film that they wanted to make so bad for years, but they said it was not possible to bring Superman to the big screen despite making a film about the similar character Captain Marvel 5 years earlier. So the script was kicked over to Columbia, who already did their Batman adaptation. Kirk Alyn was casted as Superman, but in the film he's uncredited. This is because the marketing team wanted to market Kirk Alyn as just Superman, claiming they had to get the real deal to shoot a film this action heavy. Superman's film suit is brown and gray, since the contrast looked better on film than the traditional blue and red, though colorizations of the film colored the costume blue as red, as you can see here. It basically looks like the costume from the comics, just a wee bit sun-faded, but it's shot better apparently compared to the standard blue and red, which I guess would all look kind of washed and white, I suppose. The film opted to make animated sequences impose over live-action footage in lieu of a lot of standard live-action effects, and a lot of historians, said it aged poorly and isn't convincing.
Something flew in the window.
It was a bird.
And look, I'll come back to this, but it's somewhat of a precursor to like CGI animation today, but just hand-drawn. I think this has some charm, honestly. Plus I have nightmares thinking of what the stunt team for Captain Marvel went through, so I'm fine with it, and it sells the fantasy aspect for me, so I don't really mind. The story of Superman, much like most serials, is pretty much all in the setup and the conclusion. Anyhow, you know the Superman origin. Jor-El sends his son to Earth, since Krypton is exploding. The boy lands on Earth and is taken to the Kents, named Clark Kent. Anyhow, his parents die, so he heads to Metropolis and joins the Daily Planet.
I think it's best that no one knows that he and Clark Kent are the same person.
Shortly after this, Clark's foster parents passed away.
This origin is very similar to the modern day origin, though usually in the modern origin, one or both of his parents live while he leaves town. And some beats are changed, but for the day, this is startlingly accurate. Regardless, he meets Lois Lane, Jimmy Olsen, and Perry White while looking for a job at the Daily Planet, and is basically hazed by the old employees, but he uses some subtle supermanning to earn himself a spot and respect among the planet.
And what can I do for you?
I'd like to see the boss.
Oh, that'd be Mr. Perry White, the managing editor, only you can't see him.
Why not?
On account of he went temporarily crazy over a train wreck that didn't happen.
This is when the Spider Lady starts committing crimes, some of which involves kryptonite, and some that involve her death laser, because of course she has a death laser.
Do you know whether they're testing the relativity reducer ray soon?
Well, if they're not, they've certainly wasted a lot of time and money building a target.
I don't want that test held until I get a scientist out there to observe it.
Anyhow, blah blah blah, the next 3 hours go by, and we're at the final part where Superman confronts the Spider Lady, who accidentally kills herself with her own reducer ray mega weapon. Superman first appeared in Action Comics #1, and we went over his origin already in this video. What I will say is that Kirk Alyn's take in this film is incredibly accurate. There's something slightly scary about the old school Superman. Like, bro is way too jolly at all times, kind of like a Santa Claus, like smiling.
Turn it on him,
But I guess that's part of the appeal of Superman, especially in this era, and I think this film captures that early Superman to a T. This man couldn't have a bad day no matter what you did to him. Lois Lane accompanied Superman in his first appearance of Action Comics #1, and is a spunky female beat reporter that is occasionally a damsel in distress, but a lot of the time can hang with the boys. She has a crush on Superman, and for a lack of a better term, is a total asshole to Clark. Early Lois isn't super deep, but for the day was fairly progressive, I suppose, and I think the film brought her to life quite well. Noelle Neal played Lois here, and she took a ton of pride in the character and the franchise in general, doing events about Superman up to her death in 2016.
Oh, it's just 3 days of the town turns totally into Superman. Of course, they have a huge statue in front of the main building there of George. I mean, of somebody in the outfit. And all the little shops have Superman stuff. And it's just Superman. They have contests for the little children. And all the parents come from wherever they come from. It's amazing, just packed. And all the little kids have their cute little outfits on, and some of the parents. And it's just a lot of fun.
She would play the character through the George Reeves run on Superman, his TV show, and cameo in the Superman film from 1978, playing Ella, Lois's mom, then playing a woman, Alexis, in an episode of Superboy, the TV show from the 80s, before squeezing one more appearance in Superman Returns as Gertrude 10 years before her death. If you don't know Noelle, just know she's kind of a Superman legend, mostly just because of her sheer devotion to the character. In this film, she gives off Kimmy Gibble vibes, but her Lois is largely the foundation moving forward that people like Margot Kidder would build off of later down the line.
Persuading the cops to put Hackett in with Ann. And then what? We've been here for hours.
We may be here a lot of hours.
Perry White first appeared in the radio show for Superman before appearing in the comics in Superman 7 from 1940, basically replacing George Taylor, the original editor of the Daily Star, which is the original continuity's name for the Daily Planet. Anyhow, you get the idea. Perry White is a hardened kind of asshole old newsman, and he just wants the next big story. Jimmy Olsen first appeared in Action Comics 6, though he wouldn't actually be named till the radio show. He was a junior reporter in the original continuity and in the film. The photographer stuff came with the character's overhaul in the late 50s, along with the redesign to make Jimmy a redhead with freckles. The Jimmy in the film is aged up a bit, probably to make it easier for him to have a proactive role in the story. Jor-El was created by Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, and first physically appeared in newsprint, but was part of Superman's origin from the get-go. Fun fact about Jor-El is that Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster actually first used the character in the comic New Adventure Comics 12, or at least the name. It's just a weird name they came up with, since it took letters from Jerry Siegel or Jerome Siegel's name, I guess. It was his sci-fi OC or something. There you go, more pointless trivia for you. His wife Laura appears here too, though she doesn't have much going on in this film. Finally, Spider Lady, who is original to the film, however, in 2022 she would be adapted to the comics as an alternate universe version of Lois Lane during Batman Superman Volume 2, number 16. No idea why comic creators have been really interested in pulling shit from the old serials and stuff lately, but I find it kind of fun. I just noticed that a lot of these characters have kind of been resurging in the rebirth era of DC Comics. Superman, or Clark Kent, is the main character, and this is the character at his most pure. A simple, airheaded yet cunning Clark Kent with the bold and confident Superman as his alter ego. Nothing really causes this guy to waver, he just does what's right no matter what. I think Kirk Alyn's portrayal would also act as the blueprint for many future adaptations, but I can't help but directly see both of our Reeves Supermen, that is, George and Christopher respectively, having had done similar things with their run later on.
At the risk of losing the reducer ray?
We won't lose it, I promise. But it may enable us to capture the Spider Lady and Dr. Hackett.
Well, if it were anyone else, I would say no.
This isn't a tortured Superman like Henry Cavill's. Not much can kill him, and he's almost irritatingly confident throughout the film. I love it. This is, in my opinion, just a super pure version of the character, who of course has been expanded so much over the decades, but I can't help but love the character in this film. I don't know if I'd want to see a modern Superman film where he's all jolly and jumping around, but there's something kind of comfy about a soft, low-stakes, black and white movie where Superman just smiles and occasionally punches a crook. Lois is the love interest and the damsel, but much like Lois in the comics, is driven and will step on others to get ahead, and by others I mean mostly Clark Kent. Damn, let that man do his thing. Like, fuck off a bit there.
Sergeant, no, that isn't. But listen, I know, yes, no.
Anyhow, there isn't much of a love plot in this film, but Lois is definitely an admirer of Superman and a Clark Kent hater. She's unique compared to a lot of the other female characters in these serials, pretty much exclusively because she has some level of drive and motivation to her actions, which is more than I can say about the numerous other females in most of these serials. I don't have much to say about Jimmy, but that he's a plucky sidekick, but that's kind of a given with him. And other than his shockingly long-running series, which mind you had a heavy supporting focus on Superman, he's always just kind of been a plucky side character for Lois and Clark to bounce off of, and not much more. Spider Lady is pretty much your run-of-the-mill serial villain. She wants to make a death laser. Wow, original. No, but I actually do kind of like the costume, and the fact that it's a woman and she looks kind of unique probably makes her the most memorable villain costume of all the serials we've watched.
But in your hands it'd be used only in the forces of destruction.
Do you dare to defy me?
Why not? You can only kill me.
Was she amazing? No. She's nothing crazy, but I like that we get something a bit different at least. This movie is just fun. What else can really be said about the tone of a film like this? Terrible, dangerous stuff is happening, and Superman is just having a great time. Clark and Lois's rivalry is a treat, and the setups are fun, if a bit unremarkable occasionally. I also just think the cast was having fun, and it kind of leaked off onto the screen. It's a good time, and actually worthwhile, mostly for its incredibly breezy superhero tone. Misha Belkavdalovitukotov, I can't say Russian last names, sorry guy. But he did the music, and it's a bit all over the place. One thing I won't hate on though is the score that the film plays at the start of each episode. It's an absolute banger and a beautiful start to the dense history of Superman film scores. The film was directed by Spencer Gordon Bennett. This is notable because this was his first DC serial. He will direct literally every other film serial we'll talk about in this video, which in fairness works for me since this film was pretty well directed, the casting is great, and the acting is what you want from a Superman product from this time, especially considering the era. And he surrounded himself with other great talent, or I should say he reined in that talent. The reason I say that is that Ira H. Morgan shot the film. You may remember I wasn't in love with his Harrigan work, mostly because the plane stuff was really bad. But here he shoots the movie fine. Though this is perhaps bolstered by the fact that this film was actually a really high quality print, since this one's available on DVD from Warner Brothers, a luxury most of these films don't have. That probably meant this one had a good master and got rescanned by Warner Brothers. Earl C. Turner edited this, and yeah, it was well edited. The action is cool, the effects, while really blatant, are integrated well, and it's paced well enough for what it is. I actually don't really mind this cartoon looking effects. There's something kind of charming about it, especially given that this is basically the technique we do today with CGI, and it involves less throwing stuntmen off of whatever the hell and hoping they survive. The Krypton stuff is really cool. It's definitely vintage sci-fi, and cheap vintage sci-fi at that, but it looks cool. One thing I find funny is that everyone on this planet is super at all times.
For it boasted a race of super men and women. Among the leaders was Jor-El, the foremost man of science.
In the lore today, Superman wasn't born super. It's a series of factors from him leaving Krypton, such as Earth's yellow sun, which solar powers him and whatnot. I do like, though, that this film played it pretty accurate and didn't bother reinventing the wheel almost at all. And you may say I have complimented the accuracy in these films a lot, and that's true. Most of these serials are actually fairly accurate, but it's not necessarily a given.
Off the building will collapse. Get out, I'll try to stop
it. The Captain America serial is virtually unrelated outside of the costume to Captain America. I talked about this a bit, but I will reiterate. I don't get the hate on the clearly 2D animated sections in lieu of flying effects. I think it looks fine, and in context of how much modern animation and CGI goes into superhero films today, I think it's kind of fun and fitting to see a very, very early prototype of these effects added in post. It's the golden age CGI, so to speak. Oh, I also thought this shot was really funny.
This kryptonite is supposed to handle him.
Bro just granny-style tossed kryptonite at Superman, which was a surprisingly effective way of taking him out. Chapter 15 of this serial is called The Payoff, which I think was a reference to the story, but since the film is 15 parts at the standard serial padding, it really did feel like The Payoff, all of which was crammed into this segment and this segment alone. Finally, I like that the Spider Lady gets fucking vaporized and everyone's like, what was Clark doing this whole time? Then they find him pretending to be sleeping midday like, my brother, wake the fuck up.
Oh, I was just having a wonderful dream.
You weren't dreaming by any chance that you were Superman?
That's exactly what I was, Lois.
Overall, I had a great time with this one. It isn't perfect by any means and still has that serial padding one would expect from the day. But Clark, Lois, and Jimmy are just so charming. It wasn't a chore to sit through this one, the way some of these films kind of ended up being. Also, the simplicity and stripped-back nature of this film makes it a delightful leisure watch, especially when you do what I did, watch a few parts per sitting rather than just tackling the whole thing at once. I can see why Warner claims this one, with the company putting out a beautiful DVD of this film in really cool digipack packaging. Even if I would have loved a Blu-ray or dare I say 4K copy rather than the DVD, but that's just me. It also makes sense they really claims this film and not say Batman.
You Jap murderer! If you value your life, you better address me as Dr. Decker.
I know who you are.
Because if I'm being frank, this movie won't really rustle any feathers when compared to Batman. Superman must have been some sort of success because it wouldn't take long for the film to get a sequel in Atom Man vs. Superman from just 2 years later, which we'll talk about soon. Sometimes on this channel I question how niche I'm willing to get, and today I'm reviewing Congo Bill, the serial, so I guess pretty damn obscure. Congo Bill doesn't really have much to its production. It's something that was seemingly created around the time of the Superman serial, though, with Spencer Gordon Bennett and Thomas Carr returning as the co-directors. Congo Bill was always a backup character playing B stories in comics dedicated to bigger heroes, and at the time, Congo Bill's comic home was Action Comics, which leads me to believe that one of two scenarios happened. Either A, National Comics, now DC, either sold this character's film rights with Superman as a package deal, as it would be shot back-to-back with Superman by the director duo, or B, the directors flipped through some source material while working on Superman and found the Congo Bill side story kind of intriguing and wanted to make a film on it. Probably a mix of both, though, for all we know, since little records were kept on this film. And this film sits in history as Superman's B-side, more or less, with little modern cultural relevance, especially since the Congo Bill character, especially in this form, is pretty unknown to the modern audience, despite some success back in the 1940s. The plot basically goes as follows. Congo Bill is an American explorer and animal expert who is looking for the lost heiress of a great circus worth tons of money, Ruth Culver. Ruth was thought dead, but rumblings are heard that she is the great white queen of an obscure African tribe.
Are you the ruler of this valley?
Yes, my people have honored me. And it's also a law that no one must trespass our domain.
How else was I to speak to you?
You entered the forbidden valley of Namu just to see me?
That's right.
Anyhow, the executors of her estate, Bernie and Tom, are hoping that Congo Bill doesn't find the woman, so they send various crooks, criminals, and animals off to sabotage his adventure. Bill finds Lorraine, the Great White Queen, or Ruth, and after some shenanigans, briefly pisses off these villagers before they calm down a bit. Anyhow, Ruth gets her fortune and comes back to the US, but plenty of other subplots like the stolen gold by a witch doctor, Bernie and Tom sending killers after Bill, and more kind of happen along the way. Congo Bill first appeared in More Fun Comics number 56 as one of the side stories. Congo Bill was always on the verge of greatness and never broke into mainstream comics. He would be shifted from More Fun Comics into Action Comics, which was one of National's flagpole titles next to Detective Comics and backup stories to Superman. This would be the character's status quo for about 19 years. He was Adventure Wilderness Man, and that was kind of it. That is until 1959, because that is when he got a magical ring in Action Comics 248 that allowed him to transform into a gorilla known as Congorilla. Well, actually, it's a mind swap where he takes the gorilla's body and the gorilla takes his, but anyways, I've talked enough about this in the past and I will probably talk about it again, but DC had a problem in the 1950s, which was that superheroes weren't selling super well anymore, with the superhero line boiling down to just Batman, Superman, and Wonder Woman, with characters like Flash and Green Lantern being thrown to the sidelines. What was selling was romance, war, and gorillas, so DC started spicing up their line by adding gorillas to anything they possibly could fathom adding gorillas to, thus Congo Bill became Congorilla. Sadly, this movie was a decade too early for this pivot in the character, but man, I would literally die for a Congorilla movie, especially a dirt cheap one. I don't ask for much with these movies, but this is my formal request for James Gunn to make a Congorilla movie. Though honestly, if the character doesn't show up in Creature Commandos or something soon, I would be kind of shocked. Regardless, that is it for characters they adapted. Every other character was totally original to the film. Sorry for the people who like my character histories. The rest is original, so that's all you get for this one. Congo Bill is Adventure Man, nothing too special about him. He's good with animals and likes exploring the jungle. I never really got the sense he was a nature lover or anything, since really Congo Bill's expertise is mostly breaking into native villages, running from killers, and wrestling lions. He is very equipped to survive, and that's kind of just the character. Ruth Culver is the daughter of a late circus owner, and as a result is the heir to said circus. Problem is, she went missing in Africa, and I guess no one ever really bothered looking for her. That is, until Congo Bill hears of the mysterious White Queen, assumed to be Ruth. She is a strange character in that she is like the embodiment of American colonialism. She shows up in Africa and they just automatically made her the queen.
We have found two who defile our tribal land.
It is written that they must be sacrificed.
So be it.
Now, I'm not going to really bother actually breaking down historical subtext, since the filmmakers didn't probably factor that into this cheap adventure film, but that was my witty and, dare I say, woke observation. Anyhow, Ruth is fine, definitely a serial damsel, but it is at least an interesting concept for a character that acts as one part MacGuffin and one part important character on the latter half of this film. Sort of a Princess Leia archetype from like Star Wars in the way that she starts as the aspirational object that eventually forms into a character. Bill being her knight in shining armor, or a khaki jungle wear, I guess, in this case. The McGraw brothers are the overarching villains, or at least Bernie is, seeing potential dollar signs and claiming the Culver fortune, assuming Ruth never resurfaces, eventually arranging for his brother's murder during this conspiracy. This film definitely had more of an episodic feel than a lot of the serials, but He is sort of the main villain that kind of has this backing through line to the plot. Tonally, Congo Bill is breezy. Bill runs around the jungle, something happens, a tribe attacks, a lion attacks, or whatever attacks, then the next part happens, then just repeat that cycle for 4.5 hours. The music was composed by Misha Bakalinikolov. Still can't pronounce that name. It isn't as memorable as his Superman score, but it works. You won't remember it unless you're writing a video essay about it, in which you are specifically taking notes on the score. That is my review of this score. Earl Turner returns for editing, which is good, and Ira Morgan's cinematography as well. Sadly, I don't have much to add to this over Superman, though I will say the jungle sets have mixed results. Superman is easy since you just shoot an apartment set, an office set, and some outside shots, all of which they can do pretty easily around the movie studio. Here they had to build jungle sets, and its level of being convincing kind of varies scene by scene, in all honesty. I don't have time to get into all the poorly aged stuff, but there's definitely some culturally irrelevant takes on foreigners, if we're going to put it simply. The cast is hard to define racially, but they are certainly not usually African, I'll put it that way.
He is evil. He betrays us. Defies the great god Jibu.
What I like about Congo Bill is that the runtime, even though it's pretty long, is used efficiently. There are lots of little subplots like Nagu the witch doctor and his smuggled golds, and it all kind of just washes over the film.
Take aim. When I strike the gong, let your arrows fly.
There's a lot more that happens in its 4.5 hours than some of its predecessors. Ray Corrigan, who was a famous gorilla suit actor, shows up in this film, as you guessed, as a guy in a gorilla suit.
Back now! Get in there! Don't play with the beast! Kill him! He's worth more alive than you are! Get back in there!
He has over 100 film credits, most of which involved him dressed as a gorilla. On the side of real animals, lots of lion wrestling. And look, the ethics of something like this back in the day weren't brought into question so much. There was no PETA or anything overlooking films, but even beyond the animal's well-being, wrestling even the most well-trained lion isn't a very good idea. There's this movie from the early 80s called Roar, which is a very loose narrative feature starring Tippi Hedren and her family and their actual sanctuary for large cats. Numerous injuries happened, 48 reported injuries to be specific, that ranged from scalping to throats and jugulars almost being lifted out. Basically, it was a miracle that no one died on set. This is a particularly prolific case, in fairness, but my point is this film's live lion wrestling had me wincing, professionals or not. Sadly, the only print of this film I can find was pretty bad, so if you're watching these with me or have them on a list to watch in the future, prepare to watch a digitized version of a beat-down VHS recording of a pretty poor film print. Chapter 7 is called Black Panther, so I was a little disappointed that Chadwick Boseman didn't show up. The fighting is a little western-like. It's also a lot of really obviously fake scraps, but it gets the job done well enough. Overall, Congo Bill isn't the worst, and it's a cool extension of the Superman film, especially since the crew pulled over from that film almost in its entirety, top to bottom. The natural question obviously arises, though, that if not for completion's sake for my DC film series, would I have even bothered watching this? And the answer is absolutely not. It isn't really the cultural relic that Batman, Superman, or even Captain Marvel serials are, simply because Congo Bill is an irrelevant character, especially in this form. If he turned into a gorilla, my answer would be totally different. That sounds pretty exciting to me. Look, it's not bad like Hop Harrigan, but frankly, it just wasn't a film that really matters much from a historical context anymore. And if it wasn't a DC film, I would have never watched it, let alone bothered to make a video on it, and probably just simply never would have heard of it. Which is probably an anticlimactic way to end this video, but hey, whatever. Batman and Robin, not the Joel Schumacher one, the one from 1949, is DC's first sequel, though, like the Batman and Robin movie that's more famous from the 90s, we have a new Batman with Robert Laurie in the cape and cowl in place of Lewis Wilson, and Johnny Duncan in place of Douglas Croft. This movie is a fairly soft sequel, and to call it a sequel at all may technically be inaccurate, but from a format perspective it's very similar and the vibes are here to match. Continuity between the two are fairly non-existent, though with it, much like the first, opting to emulate the old comic book style of being essentially a one-off adventure that sees the status quo more or less reset by the end of the film. We are, of course, getting ahead of ourselves a bit. As I alluded to in my review of the 1943 Batman film, however, I got this film at an Office Max in their bargain DVD bin that every store used to have, like anywhere you went, gas stations, bargain DVD bin. I liked Batman, and I didn't see this old film, so I watched it a few times back in the day, and it also introduced me to the format of the film serial, something up to that point I didn't know existed. So I may be one of the few people in my generation that can say that I somewhat grew up with film serials. A subspecies of film and a prototype to television kind of molded into one. I have come to somewhat adore the format for its relative simplicity and lighthearted stories. Anyone else a fan of Canadian Mounties versus Atomic Invaders? After a brief aside to film Bruce Gentry, Daredevil of the Skies, Spencer Gordon-Bennett, who directed Congo Bill and Superman for National Comics, returned to their well of characters to direct a film based on Batman and Robin, taking over for Lambert Hillier, who directed the original Batman film back in 1943. The production faced some cost-saving measures, with the Batmobile cheapened even further from the original film to a Mercury 8, which, from my understanding of cars, was pretty much a consumer station wagon back in the day. You know, it ain't the Tumbler. But at least he had a car and didn't need to take the bus.
Video shows intense moments between a bus driver and passenger on board a D-Dot bus. It happened back on September 8th. The incident led to bus drivers across the city to walk out on the job.
That's all we really know about the production of the film, honestly. As I said, the actors who previously played Batman and Robin were replaced. This film coming out 6 years after the previous, and honestly being so basic, it's honestly up to headcanon if you want to consider this a follow-up or not. The obvious intention, as with Superman, was to basically film the concept of Batman, with ideas like continuity not really being all that important. This is long before the days of the cinematic universe, and even pretty well before sequels to popular films was the norm. Columbia simply decided that since Superman made money, it would hire the guy who made that film to do the new Batman film. Honestly, judging by the history of film re-releases at the time, I honestly bet they would have never made this film and just reran the original had it not been for the film's heavy reliance on World War II and the general xenophobic themes of the film.
It is evident that if the Batman is to be destroyed, I must accomplish it myself.
Now, I'm certainly not implying Columbia felt bad for Japanese people for their treatment in the first film. I am simply stating that it was old news and they wanted to make something more universal, with this film in a relative sense, not having, from a plot perspective, anything that really ties it to a specific period in American history, though obviously there's some period accurate cars and stuff since it was that period. The plot is pretty much as you'd expect, the same beats as always, just with a few goofy twists. Bruce Wayne and Dick Grayson are Batman and Robin. A crime boss supervillain, the Wizard, is causing problems across Gotham City from his secret crime lair under a giant mountain. Batman is naturally pissed off about this, since this evil man is causing issues and Batman simply does not fuck with evil men. Anyhow, the Wizard has a gang, and in that gang is Jimmy Vale, brother of news photographer and damsel Vicky Vale. The rest you probably could surmise. The Wizard wants to do some shit to make money, get diamonds to power his MacGuffin, and rule crime in Gotham, though this all comes to a head when the Wizard learns to become invisible, and the movie basically changes into a Batman versus the Invisible Man film. Which of course I'm here for. Anyhow, there's also a paraplegic professor who is real sketchy, so everyone thinks he's the Wizard, though no one knows how this is possible since the Wizard is presumably not a paraplegic. Turns out it wasn't him, and the Wizard is a man Carter, the paraplegic professor's assistant's evil twin. So then Carter kills his brother to get close to the professor so he could frame him. I don't know, the endings are always kind of a big okay buddy moment in these serials, and this one's no exception. Might even be a little more extremely stupid than the norm.
You, Carter, are the wizard. You forced Hamill to make that confession by threatening his life.
That's right.
Commissioner Gordon wants to see you.
This film adds 2 new characters to the DC universe of serials, I guess. Vicky Vale replaced Linda Page to be the damsel in this film, and was a recent addition to the comics at the time this film was made, debuting in Batman 49 from 1948, a year before this film dropped. She's a journalist in Gotham City that is obsessed with Batman. In this film, she's more of a photographer, but the end result is the same. She's pretty much just Lois Lane, but for Batman instead of for Superman. As a result, I think the character was written that way too, getting into jams since she's too nosy and whatnot. Commissioner Gordon first appeared in Detective Comics 27, and like Golden Age Gordon, shares way too much with Bruce Wayne on active investigations.
Case is loaded with suspects, yet we haven't uncovered a single clue in the whole lot that would help us identify the wizard. Only last night we investigated a warehouse on Marine Street and found exactly nothing.
Like the comics, he has a bat signal, but this is notably a very, very cheap attempt to create this. This probably isn't the Gordon you know very well, since he was largely reinvented over the years, till he started looking and acting more like the Batman Year One version, which is kind of the norm, but for the era, it's actually not too inaccurate for Commissioner Gordon. Batman or Bruce Wayne in this film hasn't changed much from last time, though he is less racist.
Are you devil?
He is Adventure Man, who's just kind of around wherever Batman isn't, though no one suspects he's truly Batman. Robert Lowry is a good Batman, though I think I like Lewis Wilson's Bruce Wayne a bit more. Anyhow, he fights crime. You get the idea. Robin is Batman's faithful sidekick by day, and Dick Grayson also by day, since Batman never operates at night in these films since it'd be too hard to shoot. Anyway, he's the kid's sidekick and occasional damsel, though I will say in this movie he's much more proactive than the previous one, and gets more to do. I suppose calling him a damsel in this one is moderately unfair. Vicky is the new love interest, not unlike the 80s and 90s Batman. The serials cycled the love interest, damsel, female friend thing, with Linda Page being the previous love interest, as I said. And Vicky kind of hits the same beats that Lois hit in the Superman serial, since the character was designed to basically try Batman against a Lois Lane-esque love interest.
Do you mind if I get a picture or two for my magazine?
Oh, please don't, Miss Vale. It might upset the patient.
What's the use of being a photographer? Everybody says, please don't take any pictures.
Of course, these days Batman usually ends up with one of his female rogues, be that Catwoman or Talia al Ghul, but it took a fairly long time for that stuff to really gestate into something that was more standard than the thematic flirtations we saw with Catwoman early on. Jimmy Vale is Vicky's brother. He's compulsively tied to crime and pays the ultimate price, pretending to be Batman and dying as he learned crime is bad. This character is pretty functional, but he's okay. I like him enough, I guess. Dr. Paraplegic Man or Professor Hamill is the red herring. As it turns out, the wizard was not secretly handy-capable. Some guy, Carter, we never learn his first name, but we know he's the evil twin to an associate of Professor Hamill. He is the wizard and can turn invisible, and needs diamonds to power his MacGuffin device. Otherwise, he hits all the tropes being him just kind of standing there talking into a CB radio to his goons all day.
Car 4 to headquarters.
Go ahead, Car 4.
We have Morton's formula, but there's a police car trailing us.
Turn into the alley south of Oak Street as planned.
Though unlike some, he leaves his cave briefly while invisible. I don't know, he's fine. The costume's kind of cheap looking and weird, but whatever, it's fine. I do like that some scenes, when he's alone, he just kind of stands there in full costume, because the movie doesn't want to spoil itself, but like, realistically, if I was just talking to my henchmen over a radio that they couldn't see me through, I probably wouldn't need to wear the shitty costume, huh?
I start the robot car by remote control.
Tonally, this movie is less melodramatic than the first film. Batman from 1943 had a Batman that aggressively hated the Japanese people and wanted to see them all dead, frankly. Here, Batman fights the Wizard as a hobby since he thinks it's fun. I don't know how to really sugarcoat that simple truth. He's here for shits and giggles and not much more. Jimmy's a crime addict in that he seems like your tweaker cousin that would steal your TV for meth money. This is a theme that is never really explained. He's just kind of evil till he decides not to be evil, so that his death could resolve a Batman death fake-out cliffhanger. The music was done by Misha. Again, I'm done trying to pronounce that guy's last name, though I embarrassed myself enough times. The music is serviceable but a bit bland, same as always. Earl Turner edited this film and again did a good job. I like that this one adds some more fun effects to the mix, like the Wizard being an invisible man, and some tricks to facilitate that as well. Hell, I just like that this movie turns to a Batman versus Invisible Man film. Basically, that's fun, even though it's only a relatively small portion of the runtime. Ira H. Morgan shot this film, and it's a bit boring, but he sure has come a long way from the awful Hop Harrigan movie we talked about earlier on. All these films are shot the same way, so I don't know how to elaborate on his cinematography much further. I do think he did a good job, and there were some unique shots for the day despite them seeming elementary by today's standards between academia and technological advances that have happened over the last 80 years. The copy of this film on DVD has a pretty solid scan, and if you can't find the budget DVD for some reason, you can pretty easily find this film on the internet, so that's an option too. Just check archive.org. One thing I like about Bruce Wayne is that despite being called rich, he lives in a normal house, as we see, plus he drives a normal-ass car. He's a superhero on a budget in this one. No bat rockets or anything, dude is just dressed like a jackass beating up suited gangsters. The Batcave also developed a bit from the sitting desk to a more of a lab environment, as we saw in later films in the comics. The bat signal is one of the many stupid pieces of tech that makes no sense, though there are numerous. Like, really, that thing projects into the sky without any blurring of the bat symbol? I ran a movie theater, and to project on a reflective film screen, we needed to use a 6500 watt bulb. I say this to say that to project that much light, that little device has to have like 2 million watts. Not to mention this film always takes place in broad daylight, so how would it show? Also, how does Batman always notice the bat signal? What if he's reading a book or something? I guess I don't know what people did in the 1940s, but what if he's inside? It's not like comics where he's just always out at night. In fact, Bruce seemingly has a very full social life. He's always around. Also, at one point, Batman unburns a burnt photo, which is simply not possible.
There's the charred negative. What's that? It's known as Ehrlich Red. It'll restore the molecular structure of the charred film.
Not to explain science that much because I don't know much about it myself, but what I learned in high school is that there are physical and chemical compound changes. Physical would be the henchman tearing up the photo and Batman taping it back together. That's possible, he could still see the image then. Chemical changes change how the matter is down to the elements and is not fully reversible. Burning is an example of a chemical change. Basically, the matter was burnt. You can't bring it back. He couldn't restore the picture with some magical MacGuffin, but whatever. Like the first movie, Batman and Robin are a set of decent fighters, but not like mass crime fighters. For example, Chapter 5. Batman and Robin together get beaten down by a whopping 3 people. Like fucking how, dude? You're Batman. At one point, the Wizard's gang have a hunch that Bruce Wayne is Batman, so to be in 2 places at once, Bruce convinces Alfred to run around in the Batsuit.
What about Alfred?
think he's safe.
I love this. This is a classic Batman trope that's happened like 1,000 times over the years. It's just that ever classic workaround to pesky plot issues that books sometimes run into. At one point in the final part, the actor tries to put handcuffs on another actor and fails, then they just didn't bother trying to do another take, and they just live with the flubbed take. Like you can see, he clearly doesn't have handcuffs on, and I found it really funny. Overall, this movie's fine. I think I like it enough. It's not as worth watching as the Superman films with Kirk Alyn by any means, but Batman is shockingly hard to adapt, especially in this era, since his powers derive from real life so much that taking an ultra-rich man with fancy gadgets is shockingly expensive to pull off. The Wizard is fine, and is a much safer villain than the first film, since it kind of cuts out a lot of the egregious racism and whatnot. Though at the same time, I think the first movie had some more stakes. A fun fact about John Duncanson, who played Robin, is that he pretty much would just do bit parts, but has the distinguished honor of showing up in films by two notable directors back to back as his final two films. Showing up in Ed Wood's Plan 9 from Outer Space, which is widely considered one of the worst films ever, and yeah, it's pretty weird. Then, on the total other end of the spectrum, capping off his career by appearing in Stanley Kubrick's Spartacus, the 2001 A Space Odyssey guy. Crazy he ended his career working with a man largely considered the best director ever, right after working with a man widely considered the worst director ever. Anyhow, as for Batman in film, this would be it for the pseudo-duology of serials, though fear not, because, spoiler alert, Batman has had a ton of film appearances after this, and he still gets them to this day. But next time we talk about Batman, we'll look at Batman, the 1966 version, not the 1989 version or The Batman from 2022. After enjoying the first Superman serial quite a bit, I was excited to visit Atom Man vs. Superman. I actually specifically remember watching this for the first time back in the day. I just finished 6th grade, which was almost 2 decades ago since I'm getting pretty old. Anyhow, back then, there was an ill-fangled device called the DVD player, and I remember renting this one off of a long obsolete service called the Netflix disc service. I remember being a bit put off by the cartoon footage that was added to this film to make Superman fly, though if you remember my Superman film review from a bit ago, you'll remember I changed my stance on this matter a little bit since 2009 when I saw this film originally. That same day I watched this originally, I also read one of my favorite comic limited series of all time, Identity Crisis. That is a total aside, but if you haven't read that, you really should. It isn't your everyday DC Crisis, but it's an absolute classic. Anyhow, unlike Batman and Batman and Robin, Atom Man vs. Superman is a definitive sequel, bringing back much of the core cast, including Kirk Alyn as Superman and Noelle Neal as Lois Lane. Lyle Talbot, who played Commissioner Gordon in Batman and Robin, also joins the cast as Superman's arch-nemesis Lex Luthor in one of the few times these serials adapted a villain from the comics.
Luthor could have been the most brilliant scientist ever known, if he had only gone straight.
As we will cover, and as I will spoil now, Lex Luthor has an alter ego, Atom Man, who has a unique head mask that was actually reused from the Monster and the Ape serial, which had its lead. Metalogian Man utilized this head a few times. Interestingly, the Monster and the Ape serial is Columbia's answer to Republic's Mysterious Dr. Satan serial, which of course was built off an early pitch draft for a Superman serial before Republic made the Captain Marvel serial instead. So it was a prop from a ripoff of a pitch for a Superman film that ended up making it into the sequel of our eventual first Superman film. Alright, that's as confusing as I'm willing to get. Let's move on. This film wouldn't exclusively animate Superman flights and did some experimentation with Kirk Alyn flying through merely placing the camera on its side while shooting a fan at Kirk Alyn and projecting scenery sideways, though this was only used on brief shots with more elaborate needs still being filled by animation.
Police Space radio says Superman has spotted us.
This film also has other things besides Superman animated, with Lex's flying saucer also being drawn on frame since it was easier and cheaper than the real special effect.
It's one of those flying saucers.
Atom Man vs. Superman follows an attack on the city from Lex Luthor that includes him blowing up a bridge with Superman bringing him in and saving the day. Though, after Lex vows to switch to the good side while also coming up with groundbreaking inventions in the television field, Lex is released to help bring his inventions to mankind. Though obviously being Luthor, he was still up to some shit and started using the inventions for evil, such as his teleporters, UFOs, synthetic kryptonite, and even an invention that traps Superman out of space and time.
Who sent you? The Atom Man.
Lois leaves the planet and joins Lex's TV station, and people question whether or not Luthor went straight, or if he's always been a dirty crook and still is.
I came to tell you something, Clark. I think Luthor's on the level.
Well, I don't.
Anyhow, the side that accused him of being a criminal is right, and Superman has to straighten his ass out. Now, I know I keep calling Luthor Lex Luthor. That is mostly for you guys who are super commenters, since as we all know very well, and you definitely don't have to tell me, Luthor didn't actually have the full name Lex till Adventure Comics 271 from 1960, so in this movie, he's just known as Luthor or Atom Man. But you know, it's my video, I'll call him what I want, even if it's technically wrong. Luthor first appeared in Action Comics 23 and pretty quickly became Superman's main villain. He is your evil scientist man that hates Superman and makes inventions. In later iterations, he became kind of a Donald Trump proxy, you know, back when Trump was a businessman and not the president, as you can see by the Lex Luthor unauthorized biography one-shot, which was a pretty clear homage to Trump's Art of the Deal that came out around this same time. This saw Lex become more legitimate as an entity in the DC universe and would lead to the cackling mad scientists of this film in the early years to kind of fade in order to have this corrupt businessman who wanted to kill Superman as his side gig. Okay, moving away from Trump, since I've been attacked in the comments for mentioning racism or whatever in this series, Lex would go on to be the president following the Superman one-shot Lex 2000. You know what, fuck this. I try staying apolitical on this channel because I talk about superheroes and Star Wars and shit. People got mad at me and cried like little babies for calling Yellowface racist, which apparently it wasn't back in the day. I don't even want to hear what you sensitive losers have to say about my Lex Luthor fun facts. Fuck it, whatever. Okay, so anyhow, he was Atom Man in this film, though Atom Man is his own character who appeared in the radio show first, though years later he would be brought into the comics in World's Finest 271. Basically, he's a genetically enhanced human that is infused with kryptonite. Kind of a cool concept. In the Arrowverse, he would show up as a white supremacist character who fought Superman's ally, Steel. This version being based off the version from Superman Smashes the Klan, which is a comic about Superman fighting racists, or, sorry, I gotta quit offending all these racists who watch my videos. They fight people with differing political and social opinions from those of us with an IQ above 30. It's about Superman fighting people who fuck their cousins, or, cousins who love each other and happen to hate people of non-white ethnicity, or, sad people who need to touch grass and stop commenting on my videos. Superman is back to his old tricks and doesn't believe in prison reform, since he knows Luthor is definitely Atom Man.
I came to tell you something, Clark. I think Luthor's on the level.
Well, I don't.
What I love about this is that not only is he steadfast and undoubting from the start that Luthor is Atom Man, he's proven totally right, which is so funny since this film kinda sorta tries to maintain the film serial mystery plots we've talked about over and over again in this series, but this one just cuts the shit and has our lead just tell us the whole time that we can't have Luthor gaslight us as the audience into buying his bullshit.
I think Luthor's on the level.
Luthor is just evil and we need to accept that, and Clark Kent knows it and we should know it, but no one else will believe him. Kirk Allen is a treat, again, as Clark and Superman, and again, bro is just so underrated and underappreciated for all the work he did to create the icon of film we have today in Superman. He walks so George Reeves and Christopher Reeves could run and create the archetype for your more modern takes like Henry Cavill or seemingly David Cornsweet, who is stepping into the role in a matter of weeks. Luthor is our new character and lead villain who is secretly Atom Man, an alter ego he uses to keep up his criminal ways and seemingly go to the straight and narrow, running his TV business. It's a good enough idea, though this film's mystery is virtually non-existent. Like, who else could Atom Man be?
The Atom Man.
If my memory serves me correctly, you are Miss Lane and Mr. Olson of the Daily Planet.
Unless they pulled a real curveball and revealed it to be like Jimmy Olsen or Perry White, there's just not many key players in this film that could possibly be Atom Man. I think the Atom Man plot rang kind of strange, and admittedly the film wouldn't really change at all without it. As the audience, we technically don't have confirmation for a bit that Luthor is Atom Man, but even so, Luthor is the only suspect, and before we know for sure, Clark is already saying that it has to be Luthor. That and Lyle Talbot is really great as Luthor, honestly. He looks just like the large, chubby scientist Lex Luthor was in the era and gives the crude businessman vibe along with the mad scientist vibe, an amalgamation of which I think is what made Luthor a special villain ever since his introduction early on in Superman's history. Much like Kirk Alyn himself, I think this take on Luthor was a bit underrated, though this may be perhaps due to the dead medium in which he played the character. Lois Lane and Jimmy haven't changed much, though Lois has a subplot where she leaves the planet and joins up with Lex's television station, where she grows somewhat loyal to the man until it turns out he's a bad guy, as we all expected from the start. The planet staff are consistent with the first entry, and it's just kind of their continued exploits. The tone of this movie, like the first one, very much keeps up the core thesis of Superman as it was towards his conception. He's happy-go-lucky almost to a psychotic degree.
And he left the beam open so that you could return? Yes. Good. I'll descend on the beam.
That said, the action is brought up a peg, and I like that this serial's first chapter is more or less our first really big story cold intro in the history of superhero films, which is now pretty standard, with Superman catching Luthor after the villain destroys a bridge. There is actually some interesting stuff that ups the ante here, though maintains the relatively low stakes, at least when we compare to superhero projects of the modern era. The music was done by Misha again, and is basically just old music from the original film. The opening theme added some atomic bomb sound effects to freshen it up, though. The theme song especially still maintains its utter banger status, though. I don't know, I just love this theme so much. Believe it or not, Earl Turner edited this film again, and I think it was well done. My only editing note is that episode 7 recounts Superman's origin, with cut-ins from Lex Luthor, who happens to know way too much about it due to some, Morse code or whatever.
Knowing that his planet was doomed, Jor-El apparently sent out messages in cryptonic code. A ship's wireless operator kept receiving the impulses. Although he couldn't break down the code, he did make records of them.
I don't have a huge problem with this stock footage heavy episode since it was the 1950s, and unless you caught the first film a couple years earlier, you may not have seen this part, or it's been a while if you did see the first movie.
On a wide plateau lay the capital of Krypton, the nerve center of a civilization that was far advanced, for it boasted a race of supermen and women. Among the leaders was Jor-El, the foremost man of science.
It does, however, also add a level of continuity between these films, making Atom Man vs. Superman definitively connected to Superman due to this binding continuity factor, while as we discussed with Batman and Robin, that movie may or may not connect to the original Batman film, though it doesn't really matter. It is also just a really long-winded explanation for kryptonite, which is the wraparound, and sure, why not? I love being long-winded myself, so I can't really hate on this movie for being long-winded. Cinematography again was done by Ira H. Morgan, who did a good job again. I think stuff like The Void was a bit interesting, if dated and weird, but they definitely tried doing stuff that at the time was totally new territory for the Superman IP, and I thought that was pretty commendable. Okay, my other notes. One of the actors credited in this film was named Wally West, which is the name of the Kid Flash, later the Flash in DC continuity, though of course retcons mean there are two Wallys now, meaning he has the same name as two modern DC characters. Coincidence? 100%. Inconsequential? Totally. But what are my videos if not occasionally too thorough? This movie, I think, ups the cheesiness with all of Luthor's crazy gadgets, but honestly, for the era, I don't mind some cheese. The Atom Man costume head thing is ridiculous, but I love this sort of cunty Easter Island vibe it has going. The effects in general are upped, like Chapter 12, which starts with a fun truck miniature. This was an incredibly effect-heavy picture for the day, and it is said to be one of the most, if not the most, successful serial of all time, though things like that weren't tracked very well back in the day, which I think just makes it all the more crazy that superheroes would largely start being iced for a while till Batman's return to the screen years later, and Superman's brief kind of return with the Mole Men vs. Superman, which we'll talk about later. The film definitely follows the trends of the 1950s, see Luthor's UFO, or the title screen with tons of atomic explosions, and like Part 15 sees Superman ride a nuke like in Dr. Strangelove by Stanley Kubrick. I guess the master of serials, Spencer Gordon Bennett, deserves credit for all of Stanley Kubrick, the master of cinema's career. Good job, Spencer. You did it. You're the best filmmaker of all time. Overall, this movie's weird, bombastic, effects heavy. It is probably the closest thing the serial era ever saw to a modern superhero film, which puts effects and spectacle above all, and it reflected in the box office, perhaps being prophetic for the utter rise of the genre over the years in Hollywood till it would be milked to death in the modern day, and all but killed. I do hope Superman coming out in July can freshen the genre and make it special again, though I don't think one single film can do that by itself. I do, however, think this film is a hair worse than the other Superman film, which I think captures the tone of early Superman a bit better, even if this sister film raises the stakes and foreshadows the modern superhero film better than any of the other contemporary serials. Anyhow, are you guys as tired of serials as I am? Well, there's just one more, so the finish line's in sight, then we can move on from all this madness. Blackhawk is such an outdated comic book at this point, though it's a franchise with more of an interesting history than other contemporaries that we looked at, such as Harrigan, our other airplane film from this series. For example, Steven Spielberg started adapting a treatment for a Blackhawk film that we heard about on and off since he completed work on Ready Player One, though it's something that keeps being pushed off, most likely in large part due to the multiple regime changes at both Warner Bros. And DC Studios. And though we don't know if it would be a cinematic universe film or not, the fact still stands that with constant regime changes, and as I said, the kind of aged franchise, nothing has come of it ever since Steven Spielberg announced it back in 2018. Blackhawk keeps much of the same people we talked about for a while now. Spencer Gordon Bennett directed the film, though this time backed by Fred Sears, who's known for the film Earth vs. the Flying Saucers, a Ray Harryhausen special effects piece. Earl Turner edited the film. Mishka did the music again. It's all the same cycle as before. This film even bringing back some familiar faces. Kirk Alyn, who played Superman, now plays Blackhawk. Carol Foreman, who played Spider Lady across Kirk Alyn's Superman, returns to play Laska, one of the big bads in this film. Notably though, while it's technically out of the DC rotation originally, not being a DC property back in 1953, Blackhawk at the time was owned by Quality Comics. It would eventually be purchased by DC in 1956, with the comic switching publishers for the January 1957 issue, or issue number 108. Blackhawk ran for 256 issues and was a big book in the 40s to the 60s, but has faltered since, with a mini-series in 1988, an ongoing series in 1989 that lasted only 17 issues, and a reboot as part of the DC New 52 that lasted for only 8 issues. It has had a really hard time making an impact recently. Regardless, this film was based in part off of a short-lived radio adaptation of Blackhawks, which was common for these films, though in the comics the characters are international, so the people in the radio show speak in various accents, with audiences at the time, along with the film's production staff, having a hard time understanding them, so they just went with an American accent for this picture, which is kind of funny considering you have people like the member Stan, who comes from a vague Eastern European country, yet speaks in a very Americanized accent. This film was also interesting in that it came out in 1952 when the film serial was all but an obsolete genre. Like all film serials, the film is long but has a really basic story. Basically, Blackhawk leads a group of fellow pilots, the Blackhawk Squadron, when a mysterious woman Laska and her gang of vaguely Eastern European people fight the team for the mysterious Element X, which can be used as super fuel. This goes on for 15 chapters, then the villains all die or are apprehended, and one of the characters, Mr. Case, ends up being the mysterious leader of the gang. Laska really heads the gang, so the leader is pretty much irrelevant to the film. In all honesty, the leader doesn't really do shit. I don't know why he was here other than to add this mystery plot that they've shoehorned into every film that we looked at so far, more or less. The Blackhawk Squadron was adapted in this film and first appeared in Military Comics #1 from 1941 from Quality Comics. The characters being made by famous comic writer Will Eisner, who was an early pioneer for the comics industry, most famously creating the Spirit and more or less developing the graphic novel format as a more long-term version of the comic book. He would later have an award named after him, the Eisner Award, which is basically like the Oscars equivalent for comic books. The film grabbed 6 of the members of the Blackhawk Squadron. Blackhawk, the leader and main character of the film, who formed the squad after fighting in World War II, hopping right into the communist threat of the 1950s after World War II ended. Though at this time, he also dabbled in fighting other forms of criminals as well. Of course, in this film that was made in the 1950s, it focuses mostly on his conflict with the communists. Andre first appeared in Military Comics #2. The issue also featured the first appearance of a couple other members of the Blackhawk Squad, and he's the French one, who in this film is an American guy. Stan is Polish in the comics, and here is an American man who is also vaguely Eastern European, as we see with him and his twin brother. Charles first appears in Military Comics issue 11 and was an American member of the Blackhawks in the comics. He's a bit younger, but that isn't too unusual for serials to age people up to not deal with child labor. Hendrickson is the token old Dutch guy who in this film is just slightly old, fat American guy. Finally, you have Chop Chop, who first appeared in Military Comics 3, and come on. Am I going to be roasted for calling this character racist, the Chinese Blackhawk? Or are you dipshits gonna say, oh, but he's of his era? You aren't all dipshits, just the people who thought about typing that. If you're that guy, you're a dipshit. This film actually got a Chinese American actor, Weaver Levy, to play the role, which was a welcome surprise though, and kind of progressive considering the comic book counterpart is literally a caricature. Blackhawk is our lead, played by Kirk Allen, who is just an utter treat to watch, though admittedly his character is your standard incorruptible moral code man and an action man to boot. I like him in this film, and his exploits are kind of comfy, but I think he really lacks a good gimmick like most of the characters we covered in this series. He's a pilot who virtually never flies since that was expensive, and this is towards the end of the serial era. So instead they do the cheaper option, which is making him a commie-hating action man, punching out random people the whole movie. The Blackhawk Squadron in general is just kind of functional, but have moments. For example, Chop Chop is held hostage at one point, Stan has an evil twin, etc., etc. I like the characters, but without the accents and playing into their differences, it's really just a bunch of white American action men working for the ultimate American action man, and their Asian and old lackeys back at home that are occasionally featured for the gimmick. The leader's gimmick is that we never see his face. He doesn't have a costume. It is the prevailing unknown antagonist gimmick we saw a lot in things like Claw from Inspector Gadget way down the line from here. He's mostly just here to do occasional exposition and be the real boss, though he literally does nothing but facilitate the mystery that he's some random guy. That gimmick has been in virtually all of these films since our first film with Captain Marvel's adversary, the Scorpion. Laska is the femme fatale. She's more or less the Spider-Woman again with no costume, thus she can't be the lead villain. She kinda bosses around the lackeys and is occasionally bossed around by the leader when the film remembers that that guy actually exists. Tonally, this film is what you'd expect. Action Man fights communists with a big smile on his face. Even when stakes become dire and the heroes are almost killed, Blackhawk and his squad smile, laugh, and brush it off. It's fun like all of these films, but damn, it would be pretty nice to see something different here and there. Oh well. This is it for the serials. We're almost done, so I can finally put this antiquated format to rest. Mishka does the music again, and it's good, but, I mean, it's nothing new compared to his other previous DC films. Earl Turner edited this film and redeemed himself on the bad flying sequences from Hop Harrigan. These look nice, aren't very dizzying the way Hop Harrigan's were, but with that said, there aren't many flying scenes in this film, coming out so late in the serials. I would suspect the budget wasn't great, though of course those figures don't exist anymore, so we can only assume based on circumstantial evidence like this movie about pilots who barely fly. William Whitley took over for Ira H. Morgan on cinematography, and he did pretty well. I mean, honestly, you probably wouldn't know looking at it, but that's largely because cinematography of the day was more of a science than an art, especially on these cheaper pictures. Of course, you have people like Orson Welles or something doing more advanced stuff in their films, but yeah. William Whitley did a lot of work in the industry, also doing a lot of shows like Bonanza, a popular western of the day, The Lone Ranger, and most relevant to this series, The Adventures of Superman. The people working on serials, as you could probably guess, often moved more into the television realm, being the new fast and cheap productions that replaced the serials more or less. Overall, it's okay. I don't know. I think around 40 hours of these films made the format run pretty thin for me, and Blackhawk is admittedly a franchise I have virtually no reverence for, but Kirk Allen is still fun, so is Carol Foreman, and the action and adventure is good enough. The Superfuel Element X is a MacGuffin that does little, and the hidden antagonist was 100% pointless. I'm not even really sure why he was here. This film had some fun sets, like the oil refinery that appears in Chapter 7, and we get some adventures in Mexico with a bunch of white Mexicans and a set that may actually be a medieval village set from a different film. There is a part with a hay carriage pulled by horses that's on fire. No way in hell that was safe for the animals, though. I don't think that was much of a concern at the time, and PETA didn't exist, so I guess they just did it. Honestly, Blackhawk is just fine, and a decent send-off to this DC video, even if it's less well-known of a franchise than Batman or Superman. Hopefully, Steven Spielberg makes a Blackhawk movie in the future that could potentially be fun, but who knows, and honestly, if Steven Spielberg can do it with some actual flying, then maybe we could get a proper Blackhawk adaptation. Alright, let's rank these films. I don't think many of them are all that necessary to watch in all honesty, but the top few are worth checking out at the very least. Superman is the best film. It's something of a template for Superman in film and is a pretty close adaptation of the comics and radio show of the era. It's lighthearted fun, and the Spider Lady was a pretty decent villain. Adventures of Captain Marvel is the first superhero film ever and has some warrant. It's fairly weird, but it's pretty fun and interesting despite its flaws. Atom Man vs. Superman is the first superhero blockbuster in a lot of ways, stupid and convoluted with a bad mystery, but the action is good and the ensemble is good as well, with a really good original Luthor. Spy Smasher is a good vigilante film with an obscure superhero. It also ties into the Second World War without being heinously dated like the Batman movie. Batman and Robin is in some ways better than the original Batman film and in some ways inferior. I like the new Batman and Robin, but I don't know, it's just not that memorable. Vigilante is a modern cowboy superhero. It's a good amalgamation of the new up-and-coming superhero genre and the established Western genre that had been around for a while at that point. It's pretty okay. Batman would be good, but goddamn is it racist by today's standards. I really like the actors in this, but, I mean, it's a little rough.
Jap!
Blackhawk is a bunch of action men running around with Action Man. It's really nothing, the movie. I don't know. It wasn't actually terrible. I just really didn't have fun watching it. There's just nothing to it. Congo Bill, like Blackhawk, just follows the formula, but with the character set, I find even less interesting. Harrigan is the only movie of all the serials that I think was genuinely really bad. It's far and away last place. It was hard to watch. It was really boring, not memorable, and the plane scenes in a movie about airplanes just fucking sucks. Well, that was the DC serials. I think it was overall pretty middling, but interesting at the very least. These films followed such a tight format that honestly, when I ranked them, it was kind of hard since so many of them were just middle of the line films. I think some were slightly better than others, and some were slightly worse than others, with Harrigan being the obvious outlier. There was some dated things that were of their era, but for the most part, the films are just a bunch of action men running around fighting for a MacGuffin, hoping to unmask a villain who also wants said MacGuffin. These films aren't deep character studies, though. I think we have some important films here, notably the Superman duology starring Kirk Allen, which I would argue set the template for screen Supermen, and I think Kirk doesn't really get the credit he deserves, in part stemming from the obsolete nature of his films due to the dead format they were filmed in. I also think an argument could be made that the score in those films could have at least slightly set the mood for the Superman scores to come. We also saw Robin prominently feature in films here, someone who modern directors have had a hard time tackling, though I think both actors who played him did pretty well and were actually pretty close age to what Robin was supposed to be. Captain Marvel starred in the first comic book superhero film, which is a big milestone, and yeah, I don't think you need to watch all of these, but I think there are some strong moments in many of them, and it's interesting to look back in comic book and DC history to watch these. Anyhow, up next we're looking concurrently at the rest of the Netflix Defenders saga and Phase 3, since I'm watching the currently canon MCU projects in release order, so those two series kind of mingle in together. That is going to be a massive project, and honestly, the Netflix shows are going to take a while because they're all 13-hour-long episodes, so they're not going to be very quick for me to write about and watch, so they might not be as frequent, though these DC serials took me a while too, so I'm excited to go back to one that's all just movies, but I'm excited for this anyways. Phase 3 was pretty cool, and so was Netflix's Marvel shows from what I saw. Anyways, you know, I always just do random shit, so subscribe and I guess you can run into something that might interest you.